Vivi wondered since when the sandcastle she had built in her soul because of Ahin began to melt, as if washed away by a wave. She tried to remember her place because they came from different houses, and the difference in their status was quite large. Besides, she was neither human nor animal. She understood that she could not stay with him forever in this form and in this relationship. It seemed to her that they were like the prince and the frog from a fairy tale. So she wondered if love would eventually catch up with her when she became a full-fledged person. She understood that this was most likely impossible, but she still had hope for something like this. Vivi sighed, realizing that she needed to figure out how to become human normally first. She knew she looked awful now, but she also knew she hadn't been herself at the last event. But looking at the young man, she understood that he had also suffered. A moment later, she was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. She was shocked because she saw an inconspicuous mark on his neck. She was shocked and did not understand why she decided to bite a strange man on the neck. She wanted to remove the trace as quickly as possible before he woke up, because she understood that he would walk around and show off the bite in front of everyone, and at the same time, everyone would stare at him. She didn't want this to happen, and yet she felt relieved that she had the healing pheromone. But a moment later, all her relief evaporated as she saw that the young man had woken up. Ahin said cautiously that she had said last time that she would not even accidentally touch him while he was sleeping. She was embarrassed because she knew that this was not true at all. She embarrassedly stated that she simply wanted to heal the wound. Vivi said sheepishly that she was at dawn. She accidentally bit him on the neck, but at the same moment she saw that he turned away from her. The young lady was shocked and wanted him to listen to her immediately, but the young man only laughed in response to her. After some time, the young lady ate with pleasure, as she was hungry. Vivi assumed that her companion had specially selected such dishes for her, since she had little understanding of table etiquette. She wished him bon appetit with a smile, but at that very moment she saw her friend, who was looking intently at her, waiting for her to feed him. She was shocked because she didn't want him to look at her with such sparkling eyes, but at that very moment she sighed heavily, because she realized that she could not do anything with him, since he looked very cute. Ahin said with a smile that her friend had already eaten enough, and that she had better take care of herself. Ahin said with a smile that when he fed her in her rabbit form, she swelled up like a ball. Now he wondered if it would be the same in human form. The young lady was confused and also furious that he was saying that she was a ball. She cursed and said that he was a damn predator. He said with a smile that such words made his heart flutter. Therefore, he wanted to hear similar words from her again, but the young lady did not answer and began to eat. A moment later, he broke their silence and asked how she got to them. She sighed as she realized that the moment had arrived, the moment that could not be avoided. She stated that she had to disturb Leo a little. Vivi stated that he helped her starting from the southern gate of the border forest. She stated that when they arrived at that place, Ash was let in as a pet lion, and she was simply hidden in a pocket. She said they arrived late at night, so she was going to push him some more. And the next day, she wanted to meet Ahin. Ahin asked with a smile if she had really been in the lion's bedroom. At that very moment, he looked at her with restrained rage, because he wanted to hear an answer. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer him, as she understood that trouble had befallen her. But at that very moment, she declared that at that moment, she was a rabbit. She did not understand why he was saying such strange things. He sighed and asked her to continue her story. Vivi was puzzled and didn't understand what he was even thinking about, but she still sighed as she wanted to continue the story. A few minutes later, she sighed heavily and stated that everything was as she had described it, and he had seen the rest himself. He immediately declared that she had been reeking of Leo ever since they met in the backyard of the ballroom. The young lady was surprised and puzzled, as she could not smell the lion. But when she sniffed, she realized that the smell still remained. A moment later, she remembered how they met and how he took her hand. At that moment, she raised it when it all happened. But in turn, she was puzzled, as she saw menacing glances from the satellite. She sighed and asked the young man if it was because he smelled the lion that he grabbed her hand. Yesterday, she was worried about Togo, because she might meet someone from her family. But after meeting Leo, she calmed down a little. She thought that it was most likely connected with the action of the lion's pheromone. At that very moment, the young man called her. Ivern entered the room and informed the gentleman that he had to attend an urgent meeting. Ivern stated that high-ranking officials would be attending, and he should attend the event. But his master did not want to go anywhere. The young lady looked at the young men with puzzlement as they argued among themselves whether to go to the meeting or not. At that very moment, The young man lay down on the sofa with tears in his eyes and declared that the lady had cheated on him again with Leo. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear anything like that from him. His subordinate froze in similar shock, as he did not expect anything like this from his master. But at that very moment he, taken aback, turned his gaze to the young lady, for he saw that his master was sad. She was shocked and screamed that it was all a misunderstanding. Akin, with tears in his eyes, shouted that her every word was suspicious. The young man supported his master, as he saw that her shifty eyes suggested betrayal. She was shocked and didn't understand what they were even saying, because she always had similar eyes. Ivern said that betrayal was an act of terrible people, and she needed to make up her mind already. And for the sake of their future, while his master, with tears in his eyes, said that his soul was hurting. Vivi was shocked and couldn't believe that the young people were acting like frivolous predators. Meanwhile, Madame sat surrounded by predators and listened to their arguments. But after a few minutes, she just laughed, as their arguments did not subside. Moments later, the man stated that he would like to clarify with Mr. Ahin the identity of the Black Panther that was roaming around their estate. After all, according to the guard's records, the Black Panther belonged to the Manyens family. But at the present time, the panther was in the possession of Lord Achin. Ahin stated that the panther they were talking about was the chief of the Border Forest Guard Panthers, and they assumed that Manyens had taken her without permission. The young man was furious because his friend was shifting all the blame onto him. The man stated that there was chaos in the estate, but the animal did not cause any direct harm. But he still asked the young man to keep an eye on the panther. Moments later, he stated that there was a more important issue on the agenda now, namely, a werewolf rabbit of unknown origin. At that very moment, the young man tensed up, as he realized who they were talking about. The man looked closely at Runa Manyank, as he had a witness statement. Akin said he would like to hear who the witness was, but the man apologized and said they could not reveal the witness's identity. Ahin is surprised because they invited guests from other territories and relied on unreliable data. Rune asked if it wasn't important to tell about the identity of the witness who gave evidence for the detailed meeting. The young people wanted to protect a loved one, so they began talking about an ugly incident in which there was a questionable witness. Those present were shocked, as recently the young people wanted to devour each other alive. And now, suddenly, they were on the same wavelength. The man said they could not name the witness, but their leader vouched for the source. Last night, the fire in the banquet hall was located near the side gate of the outskirts, where human foot rarely sets foot. During the investigation into the cause of the fire, it was discovered that only one person near their banquet hall had been acting suspiciously. The previously mentioned werewolf rabbit of unknown origin. Ahin were seen near the site of the fire, along with the werewolf. In addition, it is known that the werewolf, a rabbit, lived in the same place as Ahin. The wer-rabbit was also seen with Mr. Rune Manyens. They had a meeting in the backyard of the main building before the banquet. There was evidence that they looked as if they knew each other well. However, it was strange that there were no records of the were-rabbit passing through the main gates of the estate. At that very moment, the young man began to think, as he did not know what to answer to the given evidence. A moment later, he was taken aback, as he heard from his friend that it was a werewolf dancer. Rune stated that he and his friend fell in love with the dancer and still couldn't get over it. At that very moment, he looked at his friend with a smile, as he wanted him to support him. Ahin was taken aback and froze in shock as he imagined the young lady in this role. At that very moment, everyone present froze with surprise on their faces. They knew that the young men were very influential, but at the same time, they could not believe that they had fallen in love with a simple dancer. Rune looked at his comrade with a smile, as he wanted him to say something. But the young man was taken aback by his comrade's words, and he could not utter a word. Rune glared at him, wanting him to at least snap back. Akin, looking at his comrade, declared that his free statement was confusing everyone, and he should think about where and what he said. His friend smiled and asked him if he had really been suggesting that they simply hand over the rabbit for questioning. When Bill told the young man that if he hadn't brought a rabbit to the banquet, something like this wouldn't have happened, Lev was shocked. And since his friend really didn't know anything, Rune smiled and stated that it was not he who needed the escort, but the rabbit, since she herself had asked him about it, but his comrades simply could not believe in such things. Achin told the young man that he had recently also given him a headache and taken it away, and now he had brazenly stolen it in front of everyone. Rune asked if he really said such a thing when he had committed such a dirty deed, since he had almost lost his life in the middle of a night road, and yet he had magnanimously let it go. At that very moment, everyone present began to whisper as they saw the panther's head next to the rabbit. Room stated that he did not take the dancer away, but that she followed him. The man looked closely at the young people, as there were rumors that they showed their dislike for each other without any embarrassment. But now he understood the real reason. At this, Madame looked intently at the young people. Rune looked at his friend and told him to think carefully, because if he trusted her, she would not have asked for his help. The young man was taken aback, as this was a strong statement, but at the same moment he declared that such a thing would not happen again. He looked menacingly at the young lion and told him not to poke his nose into other people's business and to lead a lazy and carefree life as he had been doing until now. Ahin stated that the young man was raised and trained in such a way that he would never even think of coveting his sister's throne. The young man was furious because these words were offensive. At that very moment, Madame looked at the young people with a smile, as she saw that the argument was flaring up. She said with a smile that their top priority was to find out the cause of the fire, so they could consider the dancer to be the young gentleman's guests. Meanwhile, Madame was quietly riding in the carriage, but was deep in thought. She remembered that the day they abandoned Vivi had been just as cold. She was puzzled because her child was not included in the family records, due to the fact that she did not turn into a human. Madame understood that if her daughter went to the land of the Black Panthers, there would not even be a pretext to take her back. So she wanted to bring her home by any means necessary. She knew she had to do it. She knew that she had given her daughter love, betrayal, hope. At the same time, the young lady stared at her mother and wondered why her mother had done this to her. She couldn't help but love her, her mother couldn't help but hate her, and even her appearance was constantly changing, and she couldn't decide. She was furious because she realized that this made her no different from a dummy. At that very moment, the young man declared that Mrs. Rabbit, whom he knew, was a very important person. Ivrin looked at her with a smile and asked when she was going to let him go. She was surprised that he had given in to her tying him up, but he stated that she had tried very hard, and therefore he could not refuse her. Vivi sighed and asked if he wanted to change the way he addressed her while she remained in human form. He asked if she was really telling him to throw away all the memories he had accumulated so far. She wanted him to call her normally, but he didn't want that. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback, as the boy approached her and called out to her with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked what was the matter. He whispered something quietly in her ear while Erwin spoke with a smile. Roselle quietly said that the Black Panther was strange. Erwin looked at the boy in surprise, as his words were offensive. He stated that he was the most ordinary Black Panther. The lady said that he was really weird and had bad energy. The boy said that he had good energy. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what the problem was. He stated that he didn't feel anything at all from Irvin V, and that this was the first time he had experienced this. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't feel anything at all. At that moment, the young man looked at them gloomily. A moment later, he looked at them predatorily and said menacingly that it looked like he was caught. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. He stated that he had a special pheromone and he could see things that other people could not see. He also said that the rabbit lady had bad energy behind her. The young lady was taken aback at that moment and looked at him with horror. She wanted him to stop making jokes like that. But at that very moment, even the little child became frightened. Roselle, trembling with fear, said that he felt very bad and that the energy was very black. She was shocked and tried to calm him down. She didn't understand what all his words meant, and she didn't understand why he behaved the way he did. She didn't understand what was behind her and wondered if it was some kind of ghost. She wondered if her life was like this because of bad energy. She remembered the young man as Ahin saying that he, a boy, could not feel Erwin's energy. After all, if the werewolf's pheromone is weaker than Erwin's, then it has no effect on him. Erwin was the owner of the interference. The young lady was taken aback because she had not been so scared for a long time. After some time, the young lady lay quietly in bed, but she was tormented by nightmares. The young man looked at her in surprise because he knew she was a coward, but at the same time, he did not understand how she got to the Rabbitlands in the first place. Ahin looked menacingly at his experience of a little rest and told him to know the measure of jokes. Erwin asked for forgiveness and stated that he had gotten too carried away in his conversation with the lady and had forgotten himself a little. He said with a smile that this was all proof that the lady had threatened him as a weakling and that she had tried to dig up dirt on his master. Erwin Erwin stated that she would certainly try again in the future, so he told the gentleman that he had to decide up to what point he could tell her the information. The young man told his subordinate that he could tell him everything except the fact that, unfortunately, as a child, he had carried a toy rabbit around everywhere. At that very moment, he picked up the boy and asked how long he would hang around the lady. Roselle was taken aback and began shouting at the young man to let him go. Akin smirked and told the boy not to struggle, otherwise he would have to eat the warrior. The boy was taken aback and burst into tears. Ahin told his subordinate to get ready, as he and the lady would soon be heading back to the estate. Akin also said that he would remain on the estate for a few more days. Erwin smiled and said that he would prepare the carriage, but he also asked the gentleman if he could untie him. Roselma, with tears in his eyes, asked if the warrior was really leaving. Ahin said with a smile that the warrior must go to the lands of the Black Panthers in order to protect them. He was shocked and shouted that he didn't want this. Ahin said that he would let them spend the rest of the day. The boy immediately became happy. Sometime later, the young lady and her companion were sitting in the garden, but she was puzzled. She knew perfectly well that she was a were-rabbit, and she looked at her companions who were surrounded by rabbits. She understood that everything was clear with the boy, but she did not understand why the terrible predator was surrounded by rabbits. And yet, she was confused, because the rabbits ignored her. Achin looked closely at the little rabbit and told it to sit still because it was ticklish. Vivi sighed heavily and wondered if she could really wander around the area as she pleased. Her companion assured her that she didn't need to worry. She asked if she didn't have to meet the head of the rabbit lands. He smiled and said that it was true. He also stated that the lion imagined her as a dancer, and it would be strange if a simple dancer went to meet the leader. She was surprised and did not understand why he suddenly called her a dancer. But at that very moment, she understood everything and was filled with embarrassment. Her companion asked in surprise why she was embarrassed, but she said that she was just hot. He looked at her in surprise because she was hot, but for some reason she covered herself with a cloak. Akin sighed heavily and asked if she was hiding something from him. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer him. Roselle approached the young man and asked him to show his fangs. Roselle looked at the sharp clicks with surprise, while the young man said that he was going to bite him now. But the young man only laughed at such a threat. Vivi stared at them, as it was the first time she had seen a boy smile like that. But the young man also surprised her, as he was very reserved. She couldn't help but laugh, as this was something new for her. But at that very moment, the young people looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was suddenly laughing. Roselle said with a smile that he saw beauty. She smiled and asked if he was talking about her. He said with a smile that he was. Ahin looked intently at his companion and declared to the boy that he had the eye of the diamond. Looking at the young lady, he told Roselle with a smile that he would definitely become an important person in the future. She looked at her companion in surprise and wondered if he too thought she was beautiful. At that very moment, she looked away from him, as she again became fixated on the words of the predator. She understood that she had begun to think in vain. She understood that her companion would one day get married and have children because his coming-of-age ceremony had already passed, and nothing terrible would happen even if he had a bride tomorrow. She assumed that his companion would be a noblewoman with a good pedigree from the lands of the Black Panthers, or perhaps a girl from another kind of werewolf predators. She understood that she was definitely not fit to be his companion. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was talking to the rabbit in her mind, but she sternly said that she was not communicating with him. Looking at the young man, she stated that even in the form of a rabbit, she could not communicate with ordinary rabbits. She assumed that he would start making fun of her again. He was surprised and amazed, as she had already understood what he was going to ask. The young lady was taken aback, but looked at him with a smile in the same mix. After all, in reality, she wanted to be next to him, but she also wanted there to be no one else next to him except her. Vivi looked at her companion and asked where he got the wound on his face. He sighed and stated that he didn't know where she was from either, but at the same time, he didn't see anything scary about her. Vivi wondered if she had scratched him without realizing it when she had been trying so hard to get rid of the mark on her neck that morning. She was taken aback because she knew he didn't know about all her actions, so she could change the subject. The young lady looked at him intently, as she wanted to talk to him about something else. He said with a smile that if she was so worried about him, she could heal him. At that very moment, the young man took her hand and kissed it with all his tenderness. He smiled and asked her to heal him. Vivi froze for a moment in embarrassment. She was very confused, but at the same time angry, because he was saying similar things again. He looked at her with a smile and said that she wrinkled her forehead, and at the same time she had a funny expression on her face. Vivi sighed and stated that she understood everything and would cure him. She also said that after this she would turn into a rabbit. She asked if that would suit him. Ah-hin looked at his companion with bewilderment and declared that this would not suit him at all. She was surprised because she did not expect such an answer. They stared at each other for a while. Ah-hin, looking at the fleeing rabbit, said that over time he was becoming more and more angry that he could not read the expression on her face in the form of a rabbit. He smiled and stated that when she was human, he could immediately see her face in front of him, and he liked that much better. She was puzzled because she understood that she had asked such a question in vain. But at that very moment, the young lady was taken aback as she saw that he lay on her shoulder. He sighed and said that he didn't see the difference whether she was a rabbit or a human, and therefore he said that she could do as she wanted. He hugged her tightly and declared that she should never disappear again without telling anyone. Ah-hin stated that every time she disappeared somewhere, his patience gradually came to an end. Vivi said sheepishly that at times like these, she became so scared that her legs would carry her. She sighed and said that she would try not to disappear again. He said with a smile that she should have said that she wouldn't try, but that she understood everything. She sighed and stated that she understood everything. Akin said with a smile that she shouldn't be naughty. Ah-hin said he didn't know why she bribed Quinn. He took her to the underground dungeon, but something like that wouldn't happen again. Ah-hin's smile declared that he was now free of the lion's smell. Vivi sighed heavily. She didn't understand his thoughts at all, but a moment later, she announced that as soon as they returned to the room, they would have a conversation. The young man was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. But after a moment, he stated that when she spoke mysteriously, he began to worry. He said with a smile that he did not know what the rabbit who remained alone with him in the room day after day was capable of doing. At that very moment, the young lady hit him and asked him with a smile to stop such conversations. She stated that she simply wanted to tell why she had come from the Black Panther lands to the estate. He looked at her with a smile and agreed, because he was impatiently waiting for her story. For some time, the young people sat quietly in the garden, hugging each other. Meanwhile, a young man with a joyful smile walked down the corridor, carrying a treat. He had been very busy since the morning, serving his master, and so he was constantly tormented with questions about Mrs. Rabbit. All the remaining people in the house of the head of the Rabbit Lands were visiting with burning eyes and asking him, "What an incredible dancer, Miss Rabbit!" Everyone was really interested in whether she was graceful or beautiful, like a forest nymph. They wondered if the young lords had really fallen in love with her so much that they were ready to throw absolutely everything at her feet, be it fangs, claws, or tail. They had a simple relationship with the rabbit, as they only exchanged good luck wishes with each other. But not long ago, he learned that Mrs. Rabbit was a werewolf. Yuan understood that the rabbit lady was more suited to being compared to a brave warrior ruling a continent than a forest nymph yearning for a lake. A moment later, he entered my room and saw a very interesting picture. The young man was puzzled because he did not understand what was going on at all. Yuan was immediately taken aback and said with a smile that he had brought tea that was grown in the lands of the rabbits. But at the same time, he was agitated because he did not understand what was happening at all, since the atmosphere in the room was very tense. The young master, without looking at his subordinate, told him to put the tea on the table. Ah-hin sighed heavily and stated that they had only had a small argument and that he did not need to pay attention to such things. Ah-chin, looking at the lady, said that if she was going to continue to protest, she should at least put something on, or she could protest in front of the fireplace. At that very moment, she angrily struck the chair with her fist. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. Ah-hin sighed and told his subordinate that he had better go to the kitchen. He asked if he really needed to bring more snacks, but the young gentleman said that this was not so, and he must convey that in this room there was a rabbit that had lost the will to live. The young man looked at his master in bewilderment and continued drinking tea. But a moment later, he was taken aback and asked if his master really wanted to eat the rabbit lady. At that very moment, the young lady turned around and looked at the young man with fury. At that very moment, they changed their geolocation, and a moment later, they were expressing their protest near the fireplace. Ah-hin glanced sideways at his subordinate and stated that he was pouring tea over the edge of the cup. The young man was taken aback and asked his master for forgiveness. Ah-hin told the lady that they had agreed that she would return to the land of the Black Panthers. He did not understand why she changed her mind. She sighed, not knowing where to begin. She was puzzled and didn't understand how he could only say now that she was going there after lunch. She said that she couldn't even say goodbye properly to the professor and her friend, but she wanted more time. Achin stated that there was nothing good in remaining in a foreign territory, one whose origin was unknown. Vivi quickly stood up and asked him to look after Ash as she wanted to say goodbye to the professor. He was taken aback and stated that they could have called her friends into the room, but she looked at him menacingly and stated that he should not approach her. She stated that the herbivorous werewolves needed to talk about something. The young people were momentarily taken aback by her tone. She didn't stop and quickly walked out of the room, leaving them with bewildered looks on their faces. Yuan told the gentleman that even with his eyes closed, he remained a predator and could not take part in the meeting of herbivorous werewolves. A moment later, the young man was taken aback as he saw that the young lady had returned. She smiled and asked for forgiveness for her whims, because she wanted to return with him. She was puzzled that they had arrived on rubber, so she wanted to go with him on the way back. A moment later, she said goodbye to him with a smile. At the same time, the young man was puzzled by her behavior and did not understand at all what was happening. For some time, his subordinate called to him, but he remained in a daze. At the same time, the young lady wondered if she could really leave him and go away alone. She knew that he had seizures, and therefore she was worried that he could die. But a moment later, the young lady stopped as she heard someone following her. She looked menacingly into the distance as she heard approaching footsteps, but she did not understand who was following her. Vivi walked on slowly, wanting to go to a crowded place. A moment later, she started running, as if she wanted to get to a crowded place as quickly as possible and keep her distance from her pursuer. But a moment later, she bumped into her comrade. She didn't notice him, and at that very moment, she grabbed him by the hair and started screaming. The young man described and screamed, because he was in great pain. After that, she realized who was in front of her. She looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. Rune said with a smile that it was too much. He asked if she would really try to pull out his hair every time they met. Rune, after listening to his friend, stated that it was possible that she was being pursued by Akina's personal guard. He also asked if she was returning to the land of the Black Panthers. She was surprised, as she did not understand how the lion knew, but he said with a smile that his name was not a lion, but Rune. She called him by name and asked him how he knew such a thing. He stated that Erwin had prepared the carriage. He sighed, because he knew that if she returned to the lands of the Black Panthers, they would not be able to see each other for some time, and he was very sad about this. She asked him in surprise why he was sad. At that very moment, the young man became embarrassed, but he did not answer her question. He was puzzled and did not know how to respond to something like this. But at the same time, he carefully chose his words, looking at the young lady. She wondered if he really liked her. At that very moment, he declared that a lot had happened to her recently, and that they had spent a lot of time together, and he was sorry that she was leaving without saying goodbye. At that very moment, he declared that if she went to the land of the lions, he would give her shelter. He looked at her with a gentle smile as he waited for an answer. For some time, he looked intently at his companion, without taking his eyes off her. Vivi looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was so taken aback that she didn't expect that there would be another person who would pull her out of the basket. Looking at her watch, she realized that she needed to slowly start getting ready. Rune He stated that her acting was poor, and he asked if she was leaving on purpose. At that very moment, he tried to detain her, since he had not yet voiced his final thought. She did not understand what the outcome could be if he was simply interested in the well-being of another. At that very moment, the young lady threw off her cloak as she wanted to escape from his tenacious grip. He said with a smile that he could help her if she agreed to go to the Battle of the Land of Lions. He said that she herself should know that Ahin was a bad person, because he would not have locked her up if he had had good intentions. He stated that if she did not get out of the Black Panther lands now, it would be difficult to leave them in the future. Rune said that the place of the next head of the lands of predators, each of whom is greedy for power, is always surrounded by danger, and one had to be at the very center of every event. He said that his companion was hunting and surrounded her with guards, but there could always come a time when she would have to survive, relying entirely on her own strength. At that very moment, he declared that Ahin was simply a monster. He said that there was a high probability that the young man had always behaved differently in front of her. Also, looking at the wound on her neck, he stated that the young man was holding her against her will. Rune sighed heavily and stated that if she stayed there because she had nowhere else to go, he could fix it. She was taken aback because at first she thought that he was interested in her pheromone, But now she saw that this was not the case, and he cared about her sincerely. She thanked him with a smile for such offers, but still refused him. Rune was surprised by this, but after a moment he looked at her with a gentle smile and accepted her decision. He came closer to her and, throwing on his cloak, asked if he could find out the reason for her refusal. She stated that if it were not for Ahin, she would have met her death in the border forest. Even after her rescue, he always took care of her, because then she couldn't even open the door on her own. Thus, she once learned what he looked like, and himself being in a terribly vulnerable state. Vivi understood that his attacks did not last for a day or two, but he did not require her to use the healing pheromone. She looked at the young man with a smile and declared that his words were true, as it was difficult for her to be around the young master. It was hard for her to be around him, and she was confused in her thoughts and everything scared her. But now she understood that he needed her, and perhaps even more than she needed him. Vivi looked at the young man with a smile and declared that black panthers and lions were all cruel. The young man was taken aback and asked with a smile if this was really how the rabbit showed his gratitude. She said with a smile that maybe that was the case, but she was not a rabbit now, but a human being. He said with a smile that as soon as she became a full-fledged person, she should first learn to tie ribbons. Rune looked at the young lady with tenderness, because until now he had not envied his friend. At that very moment, he declared that he had not learned to give up as a child, so he expected that it would be easy here too. But this time, everything was more difficult than he thought. A moment later, their conversation was stopped as someone knocked on the door. A moment later, the young people saw a stranger. Rune told his friend that this was her personal knight who followed her around. She was scared because she didn't expect to see such a face. He stated with a smile that it seemed she didn't know who he was, but he was pleased that he knew the knight. At that moment, the young man looked at the young lady with anger and cursed. After some time, she found out who was really in front of her. She knew that werewolf birds easily change their animal form to human and back. They were, however, rebellious and preferred freedom, as they lived without attachment to any family. At the same time, she was surprised and could not imagine that the young man was a werewolf. Roselle looked at the young man with a smile and declared that he was a bad bird. Vivi smiled and told her friend that he was not just a bird, but a bird of prey. Meanwhile, Madame said with a smile that she had not seen werebirds for a long time that belonged to any genus. The lady smiled and stated that everything was correct, because the werefalcons had a terribly complex character. Vivi looked at them in surprise and wondered if everything that was happening was some kind of show for them. Moments later, the lady introduced her friend to Madame. Madame looked at her with a smile and stated that she would like to get to know her properly. Vivi smiled and said that everything was fine, and she called Madame Grandma. Madame smiled, since she had not been called that way for a long time. She looked at the young lady with a smile and declared that she was incredibly interested to know which of the young men she preferred. But judging by her actions, one could tell that she had given her preference to the young master of the Black Panther clan. She shouted that she had never given her heart to anyone, but they only laughed at her. At the same time, the young man watched them closely. He was surprised by her words, but at the same time, very worried about her departure. Roselle handed the young lady a small note and asked her to write him letters at the address. She said with a smile that she would write to him. For a while, the little boy looked at her with tears in his eyes, but she was surprised and did not understand why he was behaving so strangely. She asked in surprise if he and the young lady really had much in common. The lady told Vivi that she didn't need to worry about her new friend, as he would cope with the separation. At that very moment, she turned to Madame and called her the head. The madam looked at the young lady in surprise and declared that she had the eye of a diamond. Vivi stated that the fire was not her doing. Madame, with a smile, told the girl that she did not need to worry about it. The madam smiled and asked the young lady if she knew what a predator meant when it bit someone on the neck. The young lady walked over and asked, embarrassed, what she was talking about. She was puzzled that he left a mark on her neck, and so she wanted to know what it meant. Madame said with a smile that she must not show her trail to old Rillion. Otherwise, he would fuss about like a fish out of water. The young lady looked at Madame in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. But moments later, they said goodbye to their new acquaintance with a smile. Vivi responded by saying goodbye to them and stating that she would definitely contact them later. After some time, she looked at everyone present in surprise and asked if they had really returned in such a group. Vivi was puzzled, as she felt like Quinn was about to peck her and her companion to death. She sighed heavily, as she knew the trip would be very stressful. Ahin looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she looked like a puppy that had gotten wet in the rain. She was puzzled and did not understand why she was not a rabbit, but a puppy. But at the same time, she wondered if he would not go with them. He sighed and stated that he had some things to do and would leave a little later. She wanted to know when he would leave, but at that very moment he declared that he would most likely arrive tomorrow. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand why he needed to bother himself so much, since she wanted to go with him. The young people looked at them intently. He asked if she really wanted to go with him because she didn't want to go with them. Akin thought for a moment about the whole situation, and a moment later he said with a smile that her ears popped out from the top of her head. She was taken aback because she had expected something like this, and at that very moment she checked herself and shouted that this simply could not be. He said in all seriousness that it might have been the tail that came out, not the ears. She looked at him, scared, but after a moment, she checked to see if the tail was still out, and she asked why it had become naughty again. Ahin smiled and asked for forgiveness, and stated that he simply could not go back with her. At that very moment, the young man asked for forgiveness, as his hands weakened and he threw down the documents. She looked at her companions in bewilderment and asked why they were looking at him like that. Ahin told her not to pay attention to them and asked if she wanted to tell him anything else. Vivi asked her companion about the marks he left on her neck. She wanted to know if there was any other meaning to his actions. He smiled and stated that of course there was, but also said that she had bitten him on the neck without even knowing it. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. She did not understand what was being discussed. He stated that the mark had disappeared because she had bitten him weakly, but if she wanted, she could bite him again. At that very moment, she hit him because she wanted him to shut up. He froze for a moment, not expecting such a strong blow. She was taken aback as she hit him in the face in front of everyone, even though he was the next head of the family. Everyone present froze in shock, as they had not expected anything like this. At that very moment, the young man looked away from her, embarrassed, and asked her to hit him again. She did not answer him, and at that very moment, closed the window in front of him and declared that they had to go. The young man watched them intently for some time. Meanwhile, Erwin was telling the young lady that it was the first time he had heard his master apologize to anyone, as he never even bowed his head. At the same time, he told the young lady that if she tried to escape, she would become a salad that would be served for breakfast, along with broccoli and mordvin. She was furious because she knew they weren't even going to bother cooking anymore, and were just going to eat her raw. Iron stated that she was not the only one the young master had sheltered, since Quinn had fought with Bara and was almost dead, so the master had sheltered him. She was surprised and asked if he had really attacked the Black Panther in the form of a falcon. Erwin smiled and said that he had, and it had been a rather stupid decision. Erwin said that was why the gentleman had taken the rabbit in, and when he brought it home, he had ignored it and never visited it. She was surprised that he communicated with her in a special way, but at that very moment, the young man told the lady that she had come to them in vain. He stated that the young gentleman had taken her in and saved her life, but then she should have run away immediately. A moment later, everyone was taken aback as the carriage began to shake violently. The young lady was in shock, not understanding why the carriage had stopped, and wondering if they had been attacked by wolves again. Moments later, they realized that the path was blocked by bandits, and they intended to deal with them quickly. Quinn Iscosa looked sideways at the bandits, assessing the situation. Ash, in turn, looked at them warily as he prepared for battle. Erwin looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she could hide in the hat for now. He was saying that they didn't have time and she had to make a decision quickly. At that moment, she was taken aback and asked if he had understood what he himself had said, as she was in human form. Moments later, the young lady also felt a shudder run through her entire body as someone closed the window from the outside. She didn't understand why they were sitting with her instead of fighting outside. She didn't understand why they were so calm, although she clearly heard the sounds of a struggle. She understood that the attack happened before they entered the Black Panther's territory. Plus, they were openly trying to protect her. She ran away and, looking at the young people, wondered if she was the target. The young lady was very scared and didn't know what to do. She was confused and did not understand who was targeting her. She understood that this was the man who had the opportunity to organize an attack on the carriage, returning to the land of the Black Panthers before crossing the border. The man who knew who she was and what ability she had. And a man trying to use her and ignoring her opinion. She understood that only her mother was such a person. She couldn't believe that her mother was capable of such a thing. At the same time, she remembered how Ahin said that he still had things to do, so she should return first. Vivi was very scared and wanted to stay next to him. She wanted to know what he needed to sort out. She didn't understand what they were thinking, putting her life on the line. A moment later, the young lady broke the window. They were taken aback and looked at her with bewilderment and horror. Vivi, trembling with fear, said that they should not approach her. She knew there was a reason why the window was closed, but she could smell an overwhelming pheromone. Erwin was in shock. He didn't understand what she was thinking and what she was doing at all, since she knew it was dangerous. She looked at him intently and asked what he was doing. She was furious and wanted him not to lie to her, but to tell her straight out. She asked if the young master was really here. She said that if he didn't answer her, she would check everything personally, and she intended to jump out of the window. He was taken aback because he realized that the young gentleman had mentioned such efficiency when speaking about the young lady. At that very moment, he asked for forgiveness and stated that he had a non-disclosure order and could not tell her anything. Vivi shouted menacingly that if he touched her with even a finger, she would never say a word to him for the rest of her life. At that very moment, Quinn looked menacingly at the young people and at the same time hastened to take the dagger out of its sheath. The young men were shocked as he drew his blade. Irin tried to stop the young man and calm him down. Erwin said that if he hit the young lady, her body would be wounded. But Erwin protected the young lady with his body. Quinn took aim at his friend, who was taken aback. Moments later, the young lady also looked closely at the werewolf and called out to him. Without wasting a minute, she snapped her fingers and applied her pheromone. At that very moment, the young people sensed her pheromone. A few seconds later, they fell with a crash and fell asleep. Vivi glared at Irvine and stated that her attack had only one purpose, and she was aiming at the falcon. The young man was taken aback, as he did not know where she had learned such a technique. She looked at him intently, but said nothing. A moment later, they stepped out of the carriage, and the young lady saw that all the mercenaries were lying on the ground. She quietly stroked her friend and called him. Meanwhile, the young man ran in a hurry to his mistress. He shouted at her to leave immediately. But moments later, Madame saw the young man fall to the ground with a crash. She was shocked and didn't understand how he found out about this place. Frozen in a daze, Madame stared intently at the young man who was slowly approaching her. She was shocked because she didn't understand how he knew about something like this. The madam, horrified, said that he had no right to so brazenly threaten a representative of noble blood from another territory. He asked in surprise, "Doesn't it concern her, since she gave the order to attack the young lady's carriage?" She was shocked and screamed that she didn't understand what he was talking about. He came closer to her and said that they could imagine that he too had no idea about the attack on her carriage. She asked angrily if he really thought that he would get away with harming a noblewoman. He stated that she would soon cease to be one. He spoke with their burning eyes that her head and most of his children had transgressed the law, and soon her family would be destroyed. The lady was shocked and screamed that this was nonsense. She did not understand how he could say such words so easily. At the same time, they turned around because they saw a small rabbit. He looked at the rabbit with a grin, as he saw that it had a sly little face just like Vivi's. Ahin looked at the rabbit with a smile and asked if he had really come to see this spectacle. A moment later, the rabbit ran up to the young man, and at that very moment he sat on his foot. Akin looked at the rabbit as he did not expect this, but a moment later he looked menacingly at Madame as he wanted to continue their conversation. The madam was furious because she understood that the person in front of her was simply a psychopath. At that very moment, the other rabbits ran up to them, waiting to see what would happen next. The madam asked angrily what he was talking about. She did not expect that the head and his children would come to see the crime. He sighed heavily and stated that he would ask her a question first, since she had gone through a lot of trouble to lure her to this place. He asked how much of the medicinal decoction that contained the resin of the blom tree she had given Vivi. He stated that if he heard the proper answer, he would tell her how her daughter became human. She was shocked and did not understand why he was so interested, but he wanted her to not waste time and start answering. She sighed and stated that until she was 4 years old, she gave her daughter the decoction a few times. He was shocked, knowing she was very ill. Even so, they continued to give her the infusion. He stated that it seemed she thought that the reason the girl's conversion to you was delayed was due to the effects of taking the medicinal decoction. She screamed that this medicine was a miracle, which was secretly created in the territories of herbivores, and all the children who took the decoction calmly turned into humans. He angrily declared, Madam, that it was not a miracle drug at all, but a narcotic. He said that while the girl was constantly sitting in the estate and was an aristocrat, her murder would cause unnecessary trouble. Madame was furious and shouted that he could not blame her for trying to get her child back. Ahin screamed furiously that if her Kyrie hadn't died, she wouldn't have even looked at Vivi. The madam screamed furiously that he should not dare to reproach her for the death of a child, while he was furious because her daughter could have died in the stomach of a black panther. But at the same time, Madame did not even regret what she had done. He shouted that they could end it here. He said he expected he would start to hesitate after talking to her because she was the mother of a girl he cared about. She screamed furiously that he had not answered her question. She wanted to know what he meant by destroying her kind. He sighed heavily, and at the same moment he looked intently at the rabbits. He stated that it was about the recent fire at the head's estate, since she herself knew that the fire broke out in their document storage, where the records of the export of the clan enterprises were kept, which included the Revian clan. He asked what the head of the clan was doing when the fire broke out. He did not understand how the head could leave her, his wife and partner, alone. She understood that this could not be, since he, in principle, always cared only about his own well-being, without thinking about others. She was scared and wondered if he had started that fire. Madame sighed heavily and asked if that was the reason he suspected the head of their family. Ahin said with a grin that perhaps she had another problem, much bigger than this one. He stated that Chief Aemon was investigating the merchant clans in connection with the fire, and that she had moved the export documents believed to have been burned in the fire to another safe location in advance. He looked closely at Madame and asked whose handiwork this was. He stated that the product that her son was delivering before his death was also a drug, and that besides the young man, there were also other children who were able to control fire. Ahin made a deal with the head of the Rabbitlands. He said that for information about the origin of the drugs, he would receive 2 heads, hers and her husband's. The madam froze in place, as she did not expect to hear anything like this, but she stated that if her family was destroyed, her daughter would also be in a distressing situation. He said it was ridiculous since she wasn't even on the family register. He said her daughter had already left the Rabbitlands. Ahin swung his sword and angrily declared that whether her family was destroyed for this reason or not, it would not affect her in any way. Madame was taken aback, and at that very moment she screamed. She asked for mercy. A moment later, the young man looked away as he felt someone's presence. They were taken aback when they saw an inconspicuous rabbit who was watching them intently. Vivi and her friend were watching this situation closely, and at that moment, she hurried towards them. Madame was in shock and did not understand why her daughter turned into their rabbit again. Ahin sighed heavily. He looked at her intently, because he did not know when she would finally show herself to them. The madam, taken aback, reached out to her daughter and called her. But the young lady only turned away from her mother and ran up to the young gentleman. He sighed heavily and asked if she was happy. The madam was shocked because she saw that her daughter was just leaving. She did not understand why her daughter became a rabbit again. Akin, looking at his companion, said that she might be angry that he acted alone and again did not tell her anything. He said that when she sat like that, he became afraid that he would later have to crawl under her feet. The young lady reached out to him, wanting them to go home, and tears came to her eyes. He looked at her in surprise, but there was still a smile on his face. At that very moment, he took her in his arms and declared that she needed to rest, as they would soon be in the lands of the Black Panthers. After a moment, he smiled and announced that it was time for them to return home, while Madame looked after them with a puzzled expression. It was just a coincidence that she turned into a rabbit in that forest on the border. While she was wandering around looking for something, she came across a herd of rabbits on my way. At the moment when she saw a small, weak, and moreover, wounded baby among them, she simply could not pass by. She saw a rabbit who could not speak of his pain, and at the same time, she did not want to become the same person as her mother, who said that the death of the weak is nature's natural selection. At the same time, she thought that there were still a few more attempts to use pherenium. At the same time, the young lady did not expect to be irrevocably turned into a rabbit. She did not understand where she had made such a big mistake. When she used the pheromone in the rabbit leader's house, she activated pherenium. And when she found the young gentleman next to her mother, she thanked God that she was in the form of a rabbit. She looked at the squabble of the native people with bewilderment, but she saw their true feelings and was glad that she remained unnoticed. After all, it was then that she completely rejected all ties with her native home. But at the same time, she was surprised and did not expect such a reaction from the young master. After some time, he wondered in confusion why she had heard all his words. He tried to look after his reputation after that day. She began to avoid him. He was shocked and confused, as he did not understand why everything happened this way. Erwin sighed heavily and told the gentleman that if he was going to slander, he should look for Quinn. Akin looked at his assistant with fury and asked if he needed to be reminded who he served. Irina wrapped herself around him and declared that the master was abusing his power. Ahin angrily told the young man that he had forgotten to punish him for letting Vivi escape in the Rabbit Lands. The young man was taken aback and shouted that he could not do anything about it. He screamed that Hawk had pointed a dagger at the young lady, and he had let his guard down trying to stop him. Erwin screamed that, despite the fact that the lady begged for mercy, he continued to mercilessly swing the dagger. Ahin looked at Hawk with fury and asked if he had really forced the lady to beg him for mercy. The hawk was taken aback and began to fidget and coo, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, he fell to the ground with a roar. Erwin was taken aback and shouted that, be that as it may, her young lady had learned to aim the healing pheromone. He didn't know what to do now. The young gentleman asked in surprise if it was really his mother who had taught her such a thing. Erwin said he didn't know, but maybe she was just lucky, and it happened involuntarily due to a stressful situation. But she definitely mastered the basics. Akin was taken aback, since he had not yet thought about introducing her to a tutor. He understood that he needed to quickly find a tutor among the herbivorous werewolves. But the young man suggested that his master ask his mother for help. Akin asked what had happened to the Revian family. Irvin stated that an investigation was currently underway, and they said that it might even be difficult to ruin their family. Ahin let out a breath he didn't like. He knew the lady would worry about them even more, so they should end it here. Irwin said with a smile that it was a good idea. Irwin sighed and stated that he was going to talk to the gentleman about Bar. Ahin sighed. Since it was unknown what the panther might do to the lady in the future, he had no choice but to shoot the beast. Irwin sighed and stated that this was not what he was talking about, and that what he wanted to talk about would require the help of the young master. The young master looked at him in surprise, but his subordinates told him to look at everything himself. A moment later, they saw the young lady in rabbit form with Bara. Irwin looked into the distance and declared that they were now having a duel. The young gentleman was surprised and did not understand who gave them permission to do such a thing. Irwin stated that this was the wish of the rabbit lady. Ahin knew that the girl could not wish for such a thing, but at the same moment, he asked his subordinate if he really knew about what was happening. Irwin stated that the lady seemed to have learned that the panther only obeyed those stronger than her, and so she wanted to use the pheromone on her. Akin stated that the girl planned to use only a pheromone that caused drowsiness, but he also asked the young man why he had ignored his other question while they were closely watching the duel. Meanwhile, the formidable panther looked predatorily at the little rabbit. The young men understood that if they interfered in the duel, they would become younger or very angry. Ahin asked them if he should stop the panther if the young lady couldn't cope with the pheromone. Irwin said he didn't think the young lady would lose, but he was still worried about her. At the same time, the young people saw how she concentrated her power. Irwin was sure that she would one day become a general. Without wasting a minute, the formidable panther pounced on the defenseless rabbit. Vivi hesitated for a moment and looked at her enemy in surprise. But moments later, she easily jumped away from her opponent. She landed with the same ease and grace. But a moment later, she rose up in the air with fury and dealt a terrible blow to her opponent. Thus, she only irritated the terrible panther. Bara immediately pounced on the rabbit, but Vivi easily jumped away. The panther was furious as her opponent easily dodged every blow. A moment later, the young lady stopped and looked menacingly at her opponent. Everyone was taken aback for a moment, as the panther did not refer to his opponent at full speed. Ahin S. stood frozen in shock as he saw the terrible panther approaching the defenseless rabbit. But moments later, the young lady used her power. Bara froze in place for a moment, but a few seconds later, the terrible panther fell to the ground with a crash. Vivi looked at her opponent in surprise and intently. At that very moment, she turned around and looked at her comrades. A moment later, she became delighted, as she was glad that she had defeated her opponent. She jumped for joy, as she was sure that everyone saw her small victory. She happily rushed to her maid, while everyone looked at her in surprise. Irwin looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes as he was able to discern the moment of glory. At that very moment, he declared that the young master could have mercy on the panther. Irwin looked at the young gentleman in bewilderment as he stood frozen in a stupor. He nevertheless broke the awkward atmosphere and asked the gentleman what was wrong with him. But the young gentleman could not utter a word. A few minutes later, he saw that the menacing panther was circling affectionately around the young lady. As he left, he sighed and declared that they would postpone getting rid of the panther since the lady had shown who was the boss among them, so they could consider the panther a member of the family. After some time, Vivi was resting lying on the table, and she felt relieved. She understood that if she had not done something like this, the young master would have gotten rid of the panther. Previously, she felt that her pheromone was inferior to the other predators, but it still knocked everyone off their feet. Now, she realized that her pheromone was much stronger than Erwin's. Moments later, she was taken aback as she saw the newspaper headline, which stated that she was involved in a love triangle. Last week, a ball was held in the Rabbitlands in honor of the lion's birthday. Many guests gathered for the celebration, including herbivores, but everyone at the ball was amazed by the dancer. The reason why the eyes of high society were directed towards the beautiful dancer was that Ahin and Rune did not share the girl. Everyone was shocked because the young men said that they had feelings for the dancer. She was shocked, and because of this, she shyly tore up the newspaper. Akin looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really fighting with the newspapers now. She looked intently at the young gentleman, but did not answer him. At that very moment, she was taken aback and remembered how he had told her mother that he was not indifferent to her. She was confused because she knew he had said something like that, but at the same time, he stated that she was a girl who was not indifferent to him and not a rabbit. At the same time, she wondered, looking at her companion, how one could be so handsome. At that very moment, he announced with a smile that she had a nosebleed. Moments later, he took the pen in his hands and declared that she should leave, as she frightened him, because she had the face of a pervert. Vivi was puzzled, as she understood that he himself had seduced her with his beauty. He said with a smile that it was now too late to pretend that this was not so. He asked with a smile if she wanted to sleep. Vivi was very embarrassed, and the thought that he cared about her would not leave her head. She wondered if she could show all her feelings towards him if he said something like that. At that very moment, she used her attack of cuteness on him. The young man was taken aback, as he did not understand what had happened. He looked at her in surprise and wondered if she really didn't want to sleep. He sighed and said that they would study some more, and then he would go to bed. At the same time, the young lady was puzzled because he did not understand her at all. She was shocked and did not understand how he could not understand all her feelings. She jumped back in embarrassment, and at that very moment, the ink that was on the table spilled onto her soft fur. He sighed and stated that he had no idea that she had decided to become a spotted rabbit. Vivi wondered, puzzled, if he was just pretending not to understand her. A moment later, he stated that he remembered she was reading a book that talked about ways to tame predators. He stated that efforts were, of course, good, but if she had started all this because of the bar, then she would be better off giving up such reading. He said that the author of the book was a werewolf goat, and even the content, which advised grabbing the predator by the tail if it resisted, was complete nonsense. The young lady was puzzled because she realized that she had read a stupid book, and in doing so, she was actually risking her life. At that very moment, he approached her and declared that he was also a predator, but the young lady did not understand what he meant. He sighed heavily and asked Togo if she would like to try to tame him. Vivi froze for a moment and looked at him, puzzled. At the same moment, he declared that he was easily tamed, so she should no longer go on secret dates with Leo. Vivi was taken aback and froze for a moment, but after a few minutes, she wondered if he knew she was dating Leo. She understood that their relationship was not at all what he thought it was. Vivi knew she could now give him the answer he wanted to hear, so she moved closer to him and gently touched his face. He was embarrassed by this, because he did not expect such actions from her, but a moment later, he pushed back his chair and hurried to leave. The young lady was in shock because she fell. She did not understand what had happened, because she had only gathered up her courage and done such a thing, and he had already turned away from her. Akin, looking away from her, asked if she wanted to sleep, since it was already late in the evening. At this, the young lady looked at him and noticed that he was very embarrassed. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected this. But after a moment, she laughed and thought that he was a cunning predator. Madame looked closely at Vivi and declared that she had developed a spot that was not there before. She looked at her with a smile and declared that she was still cute, even though she was dirty. The lady said with a smile that she wanted to offer her something. She asked, how about studying with a home tutor? At least for the sake of her future. Valen said she would be able to gain a foundation in etiquette and education, as well as learn how to regulate pheromones. She stated that it would not be too difficult if she suddenly became human, and Madame noted that she was also a good groom. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect that Madame had seen her then. She was shocked because the lady saw her in an indecent state. Madame looked sadly at the young lady and asked if something she had said had really upset her so much. She said that if the lady didn't want to study with a tutor, she would cancel everything because it was just a suggestion. If she didn't want it, then there was no need to force herself. She sighed because she understood that everything was very complicated. She wished that there was a person who would raise the language of rabbits. At that very moment, the maid asked for forgiveness and said that Vivi simply wanted to appear before the day in her best light. Madame was surprised, but at the same moment, the lady confirmed the maid's words. Valen said with a smile that she didn't care about her appearance at all, and that she didn't need to worry about such things. Madame said that the lady remained her close friend, who kept her company in her once lonely tea parties. Valen stated that she would take care of the tutoring herself, and she already had a candidate as an example. Mr. Rillion was the dean of the academy, and he had a lot of knowledge and was well-versed in many areas. The young lady was puzzled at this, for she knew that her teacher would be the most difficult person to get along with in the house. She remembered how he looked at her menacingly and said that his grandson himself did not understand how much he needed her. She understood that he was a very difficult person, but she still wanted to be friends with him. After some time, the young lady finally appeared before the man. The gentleman looked closely at the rabbit and noticed that she did have proper manners after all. He introduced himself and stated that he was Idis's father, Grace, the husband of the head of Valens, and concurrently the grandfather of the young master, and he also held the post of dean at the academy. Mr. Rillion said with a smile that before class, he wanted to ask her something. He gave her a short article and asked if the werewolf rabbit that was mentioned in the article was really her. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. After a few seconds of her explanation, he asked if she was really a were-rabbit, but not a nymph. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't believe the headline right away. She understood that he was, of course, right, but for some reason, her mood had disappeared. A moment later, he announced that he needed to know her reading level to continue his lessons. She understood that the moment she had been waiting for so long had arrived. A moment later, he began asking her various historical data, and Vivi gave him the answers without fail. He was surprised by this, and at the same moment began to ask about something else, and she again gave him the correct answer. The man looked at her intently, as he knew this would not be easy, but she wanted him to continue asking her for historical data. For a moment, he began to bombard her with new questions, and she continued to give the answer just as clearly. Vivi, in turn, was not going to give up so easily, and every time she answered him correctly. After some time, the man was breathing heavily, as he was surprised that she had not made a single mistake. She looked at him intently, as she had not expected this. He sighed and stated that she had tried hard, and all the answers were perfect, and his young lady was very happy. He looked at her closely as he realized that she had enough qualifications to take a leading position in the academy. But at that very moment, he realized that she was even a step higher and so talented that she could qualify for early graduation. He knew he had to do everything in his power to make her spread her wings and fly. Moments later, he shouted that they would now begin with the lesson. The young lady, in turn, did not lag behind him, as she wanted to continue the lessons. Meanwhile, Vivi quietly watched the young gentleman from the window. She was confused and didn't understand what was going on, because she saw that everyone was wearing black. And at the same time, she wondered if today was some kind of special day. She was surprised because Mr. Rillion stated that there would be no classes. And at the same time, she saw that the young master was somehow strange. She knew he wasn't sick, but he tossed and turned all night, and she kept saying that she needed to find out everything as quickly as possible. After some time, she came across knights, but they said that they would not let her through. She reached out to them and asked them to let her through. They looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really interested in their clothes. She nodded in agreement, but the young people immediately exchanged glances between fate. They knew that there was no point in hiding something like this, since all the inhabitants of other lands knew about it, and since she asked so, they could tell her. The men said that today was the anniversary of the death of the head's husband and the father of the future head, Mr. Edis. They stated that the young man died from a chronic illness. Vivi was shocked because she realized that today was the anniversary of the young master's father's death. Edis Grace, who was the husband of Mrs. Vellens and the father of Achin, was said to have died at a young age from a chronic illness. She didn't understand what illness he had, because even in the family, few people knew about such a thing. She understood that the young master was now suffering from attacks that no one knew about. She remembered how Lord Rillion had said that her grandson, without realizing it, needed her. After some time, the young lady was sorting through her things, but at the same time she scolded herself as she knew that she should have first found clothes and then turned into a human. A moment later, the maid informed the lady that in times of emergency, there was room for her in the master's dressing room, and she could use the dressing room. Entering the dressing room, she was taken aback as she had not expected anything like this. But at the same time, she realized that the master was still a cunning predator. She didn't expect him to prepare something like this for her, since he didn't tell her anything. A moment later, she sighed heavily, as she was exhausted just from getting dressed. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard some kind of knock. Turning around, she saw a hawk, and at that very moment, she reached for its neck. The young lady looked at the hawk with a predatory expression and declared that they had not seen each other for a long time. He was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. But after a few minutes, he was already sitting in his cage. Vivi stated that this happens if he neglected the were-rabbit. She looked at him intently and asked if he was interested in how she turned into a human. In addition to the cases of contact with medicinal decoctions, her pheromone also came into conflict with the strong pheromone of a werewolf predator and then reacted and exploded, which is how she became human. If she makes her own pheromone explode, she will be able to turn into a human without anyone's help. As she left, she said that she would let him go when she returned, knowing that if he was not locked up, he would snitch to Ah-hin again. Later, the young lady gave him some snacks as a gift. She was glad she had dealt with him, but in turn, standing in front of the door, she wondered how best to get out, because there were knights behind the door. At that very moment, she saw Bara. Vivi asked if she was asking her to sit on her back. Vivi was touched by this, as Bara offered her his back. A moment later, the knights looked around in surprise. They looked at the hawk in bewilderment, and at the same time, the young people wondered what was going on, since their intuition told them that something would happen soon. Not even a few minutes had passed when a young lady, riding a black panther, flew out into the corridor. After some time, the young lady was already in the greenhouse. She sighed heavily as she realized that she would no longer be able to sit on the back of a black panther. A moment later, she sighed heavily and asked the knights for forgiveness. She bowed and stated that they were working hard, but she had some business in the greenhouse and therefore wanted to pass. The young man was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. Vivi, in turn, only called the knight. She sighed and stated that she got stomach pains when she ate carrots, especially problematic if he constantly gave them to her when no one was looking. She said he always cut it up small so she could eat it comfortably, so she knew he had no bad intentions. At that very moment, she turned to the other knight and declared that he should stop calling her Mrs. Rabbit. A moment later, the young lady left the knights, who were in complete shock from what they had heard. She entered the dungeon and saw the gentleman. He looked at the young lady in surprise. At the same time, he noticed that she was leading black panthers behind her, as if she herself were a werewolf panther. At the same time, the man stated that she was not a nymph, since no nymph would walk around with disheveled hair. Vivi was taken aback as she realized that she should have worn all black and brushed her hair. The man sighed heavily and asked her to sit down as he wanted to do her hair. He smiled and stated that she had touched his hair during their first meeting, and it was time to repay her for her beautiful braids. Vivi was embarrassed by this, and at that very moment, she said that she would like a forest nymph's hairstyle. He smiled and said he appreciated her willingness to challenge her, and a moment later asked if she had done her homework. The man sighed heavily and said that she looked innocent, but at the same time, he did not understand how she could spend time with his grandson. The young lady in turn only laughed, but said nothing. A moment later, she said that she came to him because she wanted to ask him something. He sighed and said that she could call him grandfather, since his grandson, unfortunately, called him old man. Vivi agreed with him with a smile. At that very moment, she said that she would like to talk about what he had said earlier, that his grandson needed her. She asked if he knew then that her scam was of the healing type. He fell asleep and stated that when she arrived at the estate, he had a burn on his wrist, and this scar could not be removed by any means for a long time. But after that incident, there was no trace left of him in your office. Having encountered such a pheromone, for the first time in a long time, he began to sit in his office without leaving, conducting various studies. And in the end, he found out that she had a healing-type pheromone, while he stated that it was a rare pheromone by nature. He said that she must not have understood how to control it herself, and that all the suspicious events that had happened so far were caused by her pheromone. The gentleman said with a smile that this was the reason he wanted to become her teacher, because he was going to teach her to freely control the pheromone. He also said that this desire did not arise in him out of simple sympathy, because he wanted her to help his grandson. He also asked what kind of relationship they had, but the young lady was very embarrassed and did not know what to answer him. He stated that she could not answer, since everything was already visible on her. Moments later, he asked her if she knew what day it was. Vivi sighed and stated that today was the anniversary of the young master's father's death. The man stated that this is true, and today is the anniversary of his son's death. Their family was considered a high-ranking noble family, but his son lacked a lot to become a head husband. His handsome face was barely enough to make him the headman's lover. But in the end, he still became her husband. But unfortunately, he was very weak, perhaps because he had an unsuitable pheromone. He was almost constantly bedridden. Unfortunately, his body couldn't withstand the submissive type pheromone. They all felt relieved that Achin had strong blood of the head of Valens. Otherwise, he would also be bedridden most of the time. Mr. Rillian looked at the young lady and asked if she had heard of pheromone attacks. At that very moment, she was taken aback as she realized what was being discussed. He stated that his son left their world when his grandson turned 6 years old. The man told her that she didn't need to worry because his grandson had inherited excellent blood and he hadn't had any seizures. But she knew that wasn't true. After some time, the young gentleman was informed where Mrs. Rabbit was now. Without a moment's delay, he announced that he was heading to the garden. He turned around and glared at the hawk, as he had told him to protect the lady and not eat the strawberries in the cage. Quinn knew that one wrong move and he would get into a lot of trouble with Bara. Ahin was puzzled and wondered how the girl became human, but he understood that she should have waited for him and not run away. He was furious and wondered how much longer she planned to make him worry. At the same time, the young people were quietly talking among themselves, discussing this topic. But a moment later, they were taken aback and greeted the young master. They hastened to tell him everything, but he had no intention of listening to them. But the young knights followed him and informed him that the young lady had left. A moment later, the young man entered the greenhouse and saw his grandfather, who was quietly sipping tea. He looked at his grandfather in bewilderment and asked what kind of appearance he had. He asked where the young lady was. Mr. Rillian stated that the girl had left, and they seemed to have missed each other. And he also asked his grandson to give her the cloak. Lord Rillian also inquired about the lady's lineage, as she was poor in etiquette. Ahin sighed as his grandfather began talking about the engagement again. The man looked menacingly at his grandson and declared that if he had behaved normally, he would not have had to grumble. He stated that the girl came from a middle-class aristocratic family, but he intended to ensure that her family fell. Mr. Rillian, in turn, choked on his tea after his grandson's words. He yelled at his grandson that he was just crazy. The man stated that, since she was a mid-level noblewoman, she had a good pedigree. At that very moment, he was taken aback and asked his grandson where he was going. But his grandson, leaving, said that he was returning home. The man was furious because his grandson did not respect him at all. But at that very moment, he sighed heavily, as he hoped that his grandson would be healthy. He remembered his son, who always greeted him with a radiant smile. The man was puzzled, as he understood that he would not survive another loss. After some time, the young man entered the castle, and this knight greeted him. A few minutes later, he burst into his room. However, looking around the room, he saw no one. He approached the hawk and asked menacingly where the young lady was. Quinn was taken aback, and without wasting a minute, he pointed with his wing to where the young lady was now. Ahin quickly looked in the indicated direction and saw that the young lady was sitting quietly under the table. Coming closer, he realized that she was crying. The young man quickly covered the hawk, and at that very moment, he hurried to the young lady. He called her, but she did not respond, and he noticed that her arm was injured. He sighed heavily and asked what his grandfather had told her. He sighed as he realized that he was right. He saw her reach for her hand and begin to scratch it, and the young man shouted that she shouldn't do that. He reached out to her, but she pushed him away. He was puzzled because he wanted an answer from her. At this, the young man was taken aback, as he saw that she was looking at him with alienation and tears in her eyes. Vivi looked closely at her companion and asked why he hadn't told her earlier. He looked at her in surprise and said that she should explain what she meant. She remembered the man saying that his grandson had not yet had any seizures. She was puzzled, as she understood that her grandfather did not yet know that his grandfather was suffering from seizures. She asked when he started having attacks, since she knew that his father had died from attacks. But even then, his grandfather did not know that he suffered from something similar. At that very moment, he reached out to her, as he saw that she had begun to scratch her hand again. He told her that she shouldn't do something like that because she might have a wound on her hand. She asked angrily if that was the problem now. She was furious that he had kept silent about his problem. She screamed furiously that he should have at least told her about something like this. At that very moment, she was taken aback and froze mid-sentence. He looked at her in surprise, as if he wanted to hear the continuation. Numb with shock, she said that it could all end in his death. Bursting into bitter tears, she asked why he hadn't told her about something like this. He sighed heavily and, his expression changing, asked what she could do if he told her about something like that. At that very moment, the young man reached out to her. He approached her and quietly whispered her name in her ear. But a moment later, he approached her neck and stretched out his sharp fangs. She froze in front of us, as she became scared. But without wasting a single minute, she pushed him away. She was in shock and trembling with utter fear. Ahin. She looked at her companion and noticed that she had turned pale. She looked away and asked where they had left off. He asked if he had told her about the attacks, what she would have done. The lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Trembling with fear, she began to choose a word. At that very moment, he asked if she was afraid of him. The young lady did not answer him, but only began to tremble even more. He imagined, looked at them, and sighed heavily, because he realized that he was right. At that very moment, he stood up and said that they would talk later. She was in shock and knew he shouldn't leave like that. She knew it was just instinct and she didn't want to avoid him. She wanted him to just look at her. At that very moment, she grabbed his hand and asked where he was going, because they had not finished yet. She said that she was helping him. Vivi said that she had already calmed down the attack with her pheromone when he felt bad. He smiled and said that everything was correct. But after a moment, his face changed, and he asked what was wrong with Togo, since she couldn't really turn into a human, but she wanted to abuse her ability in order to heal him. He smiled and said that she was so afraid of him that she couldn't even breathe, but she was still going to help him. Ahin said that she needed to take care of herself first. At that moment, he asked how she became human, but he was taken aback when she grabbed his clothes. The young lady quickly pinned him to the wall and declared that he was a stupid predator. She was furious and looked at him with confusion, rage, and tears in her eyes. Ahin froze in place from shock and surprise, as he did not expect anything like this. They stared at each other for a while. At that very moment, Ahin sighed heavily and, looking away from her, asked her to calm down. But she grabbed his face and pulled him towards her. He froze for a moment, and at the same time tenderly touched her hand with his lips. At that very moment, she declared that she had turned into a human by her own powers, and that she had summoned the pheromone herself. He was surprised and asked if it would hurt her next time. At that very moment, she hit him in the face. She screamed that, as he had said, she could not turn into a human until she reached that age. She screamed that today she was able to become a human, and at the same time, she could not say exactly when she would become a rabbit again. She screamed that she also had a pheromone attack, and it happened because she simply overdid it with the use of pheromone, or because of the drug. She screamed that he couldn't control it, which is why his attacks happened unexpectedly, but the fact that her pheromone helped him was an obvious fact. She screamed furiously that he himself was not able to control such things, and therefore he needed to take care of himself first. Ahin was shocked by everything he heard, but he could not answer all her reproaches. Vivi looked at the young man with a smile, and at that very moment suggested that they look for a solution together. She wanted to find something that would help her get rid of the attacks, and at the same time, she wanted to try to learn how to control the pheromone normally as quickly as possible. She said that he could tell her sex, since when his attacks began, because there could be some pattern. The young man looked at her intently, but said nothing. At that moment, he sighed heavily and asked if she really didn't think that he could have brought her to his place to use her pheromone. She sighed and said that if you say you haven't thought about it, you'll be lying. But she knew that if that was all he had in mind, he wouldn't have called her the girl he cared about. She said that if he had such a goal, then now she didn't care, because she survived only thanks to him, and now she wanted to help him and thank him. Akin asked if they couldn't find anything that could relieve his attacks, whether she would help him every time they occurred. She smiled and stated that if she hadn't intended to do it, she wouldn't have even mentioned it. Ahin kissed her hand and asked if she was really ready to do such a thing. Despite the fact that she was afraid of him, she sighed and declared that she would help him all her life. For a moment, she said she needed to make amends. Vivi Yi touched his lip tenderly, causing the young man to freeze in shock. A moment later, she touched his fangs. Trembling with fear, she said with a smile that now she touched his fangs and did not even lose consciousness. She said that if she tried, she would stop being afraid of him later. At the same time, he saw that she felt very ill when she touched him. But moments later, he kissed her hand tenderly. The young lady was taken aback and said that she understood that he had deliberately said nasty things out of concern that she would overdo it with her ability. She told him that he shouldn't worry, because even without his words, her life is more important to her than anything else. She said that for this reason, she would take care of herself first and then help him, and he didn't need to worry about it. She said that she would never leave him until his attacks stopped. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, he lifted her up and pulled her closer to him. He kissed her tenderly and asked how he should take what she had said. Vivi was confused and didn't know what to answer him. He asked if she would really spend the rest of her life with him, if his attacks would torment him for the rest of his life. She froze for a moment in embarrassment, as she did not expect such a question. He smiled and asked if he was really right. She was shocked, because she understood that he was just a cunning predator. He said with a smile that she was the only cunning one here. He said with a smile that he could never have imagined that the next head of the family would crawl at the paws of the rabbit he had sheltered. She sighed and stated that he had never crawled at her paws. At that very moment, he asked if this was really so. She said he had never done anything like that before, and only yesterday morning he said he would add it to the salad. At that very moment, the young man kissed her tenderly. Akin said with a smile that from now on he would crawl, since he had nowhere to go. A moment later, the young lady looked at her companion with embarrassment as he came closer and closer to her. A moment later, he moved even closer to her and touched her tenderly. But at that very moment, he noticed something and could not help but laugh as the young lady became embarrassed and pursed her lips for a kiss. Vivi opened her eyes as she realized that nothing had happened. And at that moment, she saw that he was trembling, covering his face. She got scared because she thought he was having another attack. She asked him if he was okay, but at that very moment, he burst out laughing right in her face. He screamed that he saw her face, which was filled with anticipation. He understood that she was just a lustful rabbit. Vivi looked at the young man with fury, because she understood that she would simply kill him herself soon. She immediately turned her gaze away from him and declared that he should move away from her. Akin, with a satisfied smile, reached closer to her and asked where she was going. She stated that she had a lot of important things to do, and it was time for her to go. A moment later, Ahin announced that they had important business left, and without wasting a minute, he kissed her tenderly. After a few minutes of kissing, the young lady pulled away from him and became embarrassed. He asked with a smile if she was against it. Vivi shyly shouted that she didn't mind. He smiled and said that she should open her mouth. At that very moment, the young lady obeyed his words. Ahin looked at her with a smile and kissed her again tenderly. For some time, the young people lay on the damp ground and kissed each other. After a moment, she pulled away from him and asked for a little time. He was surprised because he didn't understand what had happened. But the young lady said that she was just having trouble breathing. Akin said that this basically makes it hard to breathe. Vivi was shocked and didn't understand what he was even talking about. She wanted them to rest a little. He asked with a smile if she really just wanted to rest and not stop. Hugging his companion, he said that she was just a cunning rabbit. A moment later, he asked if rest was necessary. The young lady was confused as she realized that her companion had become strange and also cunning. She was confused and didn't understand why he was okay, because she felt like she had been running with all her might. He said with a smile that he had never felt anything like it and did not know, while he opened his mouth, preparing for a new bite. She was puzzled and didn't understand what he was doing at all. But at that very moment, she saw his fangs on her body. A moment later, the young lady could not bear it any longer and fell unconscious. He looked at her with a smile, as he was surprised and puzzled by everything that was happening. Achin called the young lady, but it was all in vain. A moment later, he realized he had made a mistake and bitten her. Sometime later, he looked intently at the lady who was lying quietly released. At the same time, she writhed in her sleep, as she dreamed that he was biting her again. Akin looked at his companion with a smile. He knew that when the morning came, he would call the designer, as he wanted to completely redesign her wardrobe to suit her. He remembered her saying that when he had an attack, she would use the pheromone no matter the time. Ahin looked at the lady tenderly as she made a sweet proposal. But he was puzzled and didn't know if it would be right to stabilize his condition with her pheromone. The last time he had an attack, he felt as if his submissive pheromone had been absorbed by the lady's settling pheromone. Moreover, he could not control his own pheromone, and he was afraid that it might frighten her. But he saw that she was brave, and despite the fact that she was a coward, she did not back down. but he also understood that it would be safer if he distanced himself from her. Akin sighed heavily, as he understood that he had to think about this too because of the pheromone. At that moment, he sighed heavily and wondered what his father was thinking when he left his mother alone. He understood the complexity of the situation, but at the same time, he didn't know what to do. But he saw a sleeping young lady who was beckoning to him and who was repeating his name. He sighed heavily and asked his father what he should do in this situation. The next morning, the young lady was fidgeting nervously in her bed. She was puzzled because she knew that if she had been more persistent, she would have been able to find out about his attacks. At that moment, she remembered his lips, and throwing them out of her head, she realized that she could hide her true feelings. At the same time, Ash looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand her behavior. A moment later, he jumped onto the bed, causing the young lady to jump unexpectedly. She looked at him with a smile and declared that she was not in any pain at all and that he did not need to worry. A moment later, she greeted Bara with a smile, but the bar turned away from her and growled menacingly, and the jeweler wondered if she really didn't like her yet. Mamie Room told the panther to get off the bed slowly. Vivi looked at the maid in surprise and asked where the young master was now. The maid reported that the head of the family had called him, and she also told the girl that she had brought a newspaper from the rabbit territory that she had spoken of earlier. She wondered if there had been no article about the terrible incident that had happened at the chief's mansion. She knew there had been no mention of the fire, but she wanted to know what had happened to her family. She wondered if Madame had decided to sort everything out secretly. Vivi sighed heavily as she realized that this was all simply useless. She thanked the maid for bringing her the newspaper, but said she didn't need them anymore. Vivi looked at the maid with a smile and asked if she would tell the young master about this. She stated that she would not report such a trifle to him. The young lady was very glad about this. At that very hour, the maid informed the lady that guests would soon be arriving, so she should get ready without wasting a minute. She took the young lady in her arms. Vivi was very confused and did not understand what was happening at all because she was a human and could move independently. Meanwhile, the man angrily asked his colleagues where in the world there were fields. He told them not to say such things and to get to work quickly. But they told their leader that he had not seen her yesterday because she was completely different from the members of the Black Panther family. They said that he also secretly wanted to visit her. They asked if he was not interested in knowing what she looked like in human form. After some time, Madame entered the dining room, where her relatives were waiting for her. Achin looked menacingly at his grandfather and declared that he was talking nonsense. The man stated that he is free to say whatever he wants. Moments later, Madame joined them and slammed the table to silence them. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, she introduced herself to them. Moments later, she angrily declared that she felt ignored in her own home. Mr. Rillian was shocked and did not understand what she was talking about. He wanted to know what kind of bastard dared to do something like that. Madame Grosno stated that Anna alone had not seen her. He was puzzled and did not understand what was being discussed, but his grandson stated that she was talking about the nymph that everyone was discussing. The man was taken aback and froze in place, as he did not understand who they were talking about. Balance stated that her father met her in the greenhouse, and she spoke of the rabbit nymph that was ringing in every corner of the estate. She was puzzled and screamed and asked why he didn't leave her a portrait of him, how she ran, riding Bara. Madame said she didn't know when the lady would turn into a rabbit again, so she wanted to meet her before the meeting started. Valen stated that she would not contact him, so they could start with the meeting. Madame stated that his birthday would soon be coming up. He sighed heavily and said that he knew perfectly well what she wanted to say. He knew that everyone at the banquet would be talking about the young lady, so he wanted to think of a way to introduce her to them. Madame remarked with a smile that her son knew her well. He said that they could shut everyone's mouths, as he did not want to see her being discussed. The lady asked if she should speak out on this matter. Ahin asked if she would be okay if they used the lady for political purposes. Madame only laughed at his words. She looked at her son with a smile and declared that he knew well how much she treasured the little ball of fur, so he could leave all the questions to her. Ahin said with a smile that, in that case, her action would be a birthday present to him. Mr. Rillian Sill said that the girl is very smart, so she will get used to the life of an aristocrat. But if her origin is a problem for them, then he will force a good family to adopt her. He said with a smile that she had round features and was very cute, so the elders would like her. Everyone looked at him in surprise and asked if he was drunk. Mr. Rillian looked at his grandson with fury. The young man stated that he found it hard to believe that his grandfather could have become attracted to the lady after only a week of training. He asked his mother when she had managed to teach her how to direct the pheromone during use. The lady was surprised and asked what he was talking about. She asked if it required any special training. He thought that her grandfather taught her before she went to her lands. The man said that he did not do this, since he could not even approach her. At the same time, they were puzzled, because they did not know who had managed to teach her such a thing. Akin understood that it would be difficult for her to deal with something like this alone. He knew she had a high-level pheromone, and yet he wondered if the lion had taught her that. He was furious because the lion had reappeared in his sight. Meanwhile, the young lady stood quietly at the window and waited for the young gentleman. Ahin's birthday was coming up soon. Vivi was puzzled and wondered what she could do for him. She knew she had to give him something, but it had to be a thoughtful gift. She wanted to ask him what he wanted when they met, but she hadn't seen him for a long time. At that very moment, she began to wonder how her birthdays had been. She remembered that when she was little, she was given a party hat. But as she grew older, she stopped receiving congratulations, so she did not know what and how to do. A moment later, all her thoughts disappeared as she heard some strange sound, and she was scared because she didn't understand where it was coming from. She thought it was probably a hawk, but listening more closely, she wondered who was there. A moment later, Erwin announced that it was him. Opening the curtain, the young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to see anything like this. She asked in surprise how they had gotten to her. Erwin sighed heavily and, staggering, stated that he had climbed onto the balcony in his true form. For a while, the young lady looked at them in surprise, not understanding what was going on at all. She was in shock and did not understand what they wanted from her. But at that very moment, she hurried to close the door. But Erwin propped the door up, preventing her from closing it. The young lady froze in place and trembled with fear. She did not realize when the genre changed to horror. At that very moment, his expression changed, and he declared that he had come to her on a very serious matter. Vivi was taken aback, and, trembling with fear, asked what exactly he had come to her for. At that very moment, he asked her if she had quarreled with the young gentleman. She looked away from him in embarrassment and said that they had quarreled last night, but she knew that it had ended with a kiss, so it could be said that everything had been resolved. She stated that they seemed to have made up. He looked menacingly at the young lady and stated that she didn't look like they had made up, and he also said that tails were cut off for lying in the lands of the Black Panthers. Vivi flinched as she didn't expect to hear that. At that very moment, she declared that she was not lying. He sighed heavily as he understood everything, but asked if they had made up. She was shocked and didn't understand why he was worried about something like that. Vivi said that he could tell her everything straight because she would listen to him. She said that he would be angry with her. At that very moment, he sighed and declared that the young gentleman was behaving strangely. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what was so serious about it. At that moment, they looked at her menacingly. She sighed and asked for forgiveness, and also asked him to continue his story. Erwin reported that at first, the young gentleman gazed thoughtfully out the window, and then began to read a book that he had previously not even wanted to touch, and then he began to responsibly do paperwork. She sighed, because this already sounded serious. Erwin also reported that the young gentleman praised him, and he even spoke flatteringly about his chatter. She was shocked, as she realized that this was already serious. Erwin stated that the young gentleman behaved like a completely normal person, and he only behaved like this when he was in a bad mood. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if he was in a bad mood. She was scared and wondered if her kiss was that bad. At that moment, she froze, because she realized that he liked everything. She wondered if he could be offended by the fact that she got angry and yelled at him, but at the same moment, she assumed that she had put too much pressure on him. Erwin stated that he even looked into the kitchen to see if she was there, because the young gentleman had left the office early today. He said that he assumed that baked rabbit would be served on the young gentleman's table today. She was taken aback because she knew that this simply could not happen. Erwin looked menacingly at the young lady and asked if she had any guesses. She said, embarrassed and thoughtful, that she grabbed him by the collar of his clothes, but her grip was not very strong, but on the contrary, weak. The young man explained that he had not expected to hear anything like that at all. At that very moment, she screamed that it was because of her that he hit his head on the table. They were shocked and understood that this was a terrible story. At that very moment, Erwin said that she should leave the door to the balcony open. He sighed and declared that this time, the young master could really come for her soul. Erwin said that if the master behaved normally with her, she should immediately turn into a rabbit and run away. He said that the hawk, despite his slight inadequacy, would not abandon her in such a situation. He said that he was afraid of the possible consequences, so it would be better for them not to fly to his room, and it would be better for them to go to the ladies' room. Vivi asked what he meant by a normal attitude towards her. He said that the young master can behave like a gentleman. At that very moment, the young people were taken aback as they heard a noise outside the door. Vivi screamed as she realized that the young master had already returned. She turned to them and shouted at them to run away quickly. But at that very moment, she saw that the young man had transformed into his animal form. She looked after them, puzzled, because she understood that he quickly realized that he needed to run away. A moment later, the young man bowed to the gentleman and was about to leave. Vivi thought for a moment and wondered what would happen if the young man behaved normally. She imagined this picture in her head, and she wondered, what if he spoke to her politely? She didn't know what to do if he behaved gallantly towards her. Meanwhile, the hawk looked at the young lady with puzzlement as he saw that she was already deep in thought. She understood that she had to calm down, because help was already ready outside. She knew that if he behaved normally, she would immediately run away. Vivi understood that Madame and grandfather would never abandon her. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw the young gentleman in beast form. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she had expected something completely different. For a moment, the young lady stared at the young gentleman who stood next to her and yawned. She didn't know what to do in this situation, and a moment later, Ahin simply jumped onto his bed and lay down quietly. She slowly approached him and asked if he had had an attack. She realized that he was avoiding repeating her questions from yesterday. Vivi looked menacingly at the young man and asked what he had done. She wanted to know why he was angry with her, but he just looked at her with a smile and winked. She came closer to him and looked intently into his eyes. At that very moment, she reached for his tail and asked him to calm down. But a moment later, he took his tail back, and she was taken aback as he brushed her off. Vivi knew she had to calm down and talk to him softly, kindly, and calmly. She sighed and calmly stated that yesterday was the anniversary of his father's death. And instead of comforting him, she began to interrogate him, so she asked for forgiveness. But he only snorted in response. She looked at him menacingly, as she just wanted to hit him. The young lady was shocked and wondered if it was always this hard to talk to animals. She knew she had to restrain herself because she couldn't go to jail for murder. Now she realized that he had always endured this. Vivi couldn't stand it and said that he shouldn't be angry. She wanted to know what was the matter. Venya saw that he was writing something with his tail in the air. A moment later, he said that she was a cheating rabbit. She was taken aback and angrily asked why she was a cheating rabbit. At that very moment, she looked at him with fury and asked why he had turned his butt towards her. She screamed that she would hit him. Vivi screamed and demanded an explanation from him. Otherwise, she would have beaten him up good. At that very moment, he began to draw words in the air, and she read the lion's name. He said that since she had not told him about the lion, he would not tell her anything about himself. At the same time, the young lady was furious. She did not understand where the logic was here. She shouted that these were completely different situations. She said that she had not hidden anything from him at all, because since returning to the head's estate, she had never met Lev. At that very moment, she saw his menacing gaze after she called the lion by name. Vivi was shocked and said that this was a complete upset. She wanted him to say directly what he was not happy with. She was puzzled and did not understand what was going on and why he was acting so strangely. She wanted to know what he had heard from the hawk or from Erwin. She didn't think anyone had heard their conversation before she left. At that very moment, she wondered if they were really talking about dancing. He was taken aback, and at the same moment, he looked at her with bewilderment. He was shocked and hoped that she wasn't doing the rabbit dance, which even he had never seen in front of Leo. At that very moment, he looked at her sullenly, and the young lady realized that the end had come for her. She shouted that she didn't want to dance. Vivi sighed and stated that she simply needed to tell the lion that she would soon be turning into a human. And then she was very worried that Togo herself, without noticing, used the signal that they had previously agreed on. She sighed heavily and asked him to look at her, but he refused her such a request. Vivi, looking at him, declared that the next time she turned into a rabbit, she would definitely dance in front of him at least a little. At that very moment, he beamed before her eyes. She sighed heavily, as she was glad that he finally looked like himself. She asked if everything was okay now. A moment later, the young lady said that he could now turn into a human, because she wanted him to answer her questions. But at that very moment, she saw that he had no intention of doing something like that. She was furious at his actions. Vivi began to scream with rage that he was just a vile predator, and at the same time, she spanked him on the softest spot. He only purred in response, and she screamed in embarrassment that he should not enjoy this. After some time, the young man woke up in a cold sweat late at night. He was puzzled because he realized that the periods of relief were becoming shorter and shorter. He was in shock and wondered how his father ever coped with this disease. A moment later, he turned around and saw a young lady next to him who was sleeping peacefully and quietly. He was taken aback for a moment and froze in place as he saw her thin neck while his heart was beating very hard. The young man was tormented by thirst and his heart was burning. He understood that if he bit her neck, he would definitely be able to quench his thirst. The scent penetrated straight into his heart, and he understood that it was a healing pheromone. He wanted to immediately absorb her sweet pheromone without a trace. But in turn, the young man restrained himself as best he could. He knew he had to act differently and let go of all thoughts of absorbing her pheromone. Moments later, he came to his senses and realized that he had almost harmed the young lady. He looked at her intently as he saw that she was sleeping quietly, not even suspecting what he wanted to do with her. Ah-hin touched her face tenderly, and she purred softly. He looked at her tenderly because he was afraid of losing her. He understood that she was still a little ball of fur, who could have died the very second he looked away from her. He knew that she might try to escape from him as soon as she turned into a human, and at the same time, he understood that she might simply fall in love with a lion and leave him. But he wanted to do something that would keep her close to him. More than anything in the world, he was afraid of losing her. And more than anything in the world, he liked her concern about his attacks. He was pleased that she was simply interested in his health. Because of her kindness, she learned more about his attacks, and he understood that because of this, she felt love for him. Achin understood that if it was just sympathy, as long as it came from her, that was enough for him. Ah-hin sighed heavily and told his subordinate to leave immediately. Moments later, the hawk appeared in his field of vision. Achin was puzzled because he had not ordered the hawk to guard the balcony. He did not understand why it was doing something that he was not commanded to do. Achin looked at the hawk in surprise as he saw that he was afraid to answer his questions. At that moment, he sighed heavily and declared that, unlike Erwin, showing gentleness in front of Madame Rabbit was not his style. The hawk looked away, but did not answer his master. The young man sighed heavily, for he realized that when he looked at the hawk, he saw her young lady in the form of a rabbit. At that very moment, he declared that as punishment for his willfulness, he would not receive any strawberries for a week. Hawk was shocked by this. At that very moment, the young man announced that he had work for the hawk. He looked menacingly at the bird and declared that he must deliver the letter straight to Rune. The hawk nodded quickly to his master, and a moment later he fluttered into the sky and flew away holding the letter in his beak. Vivi, not him. Ah-hin looked at the hawk with a smile and declared that he, like no one else, knew who he really was. The hawk understood what his master was talking about, and at that very moment he flew off to carry out his instructions. Several years ago, Ah-hin met the second son of the Magnientz family. The election of a successor took place in the territory of Lviv. Leona Magnientz was the leading candidate, and everyone understood that there would be no major disagreements. As a precaution, they were allowed to remain in the Black Panther lands for a while, in case the allies of one side decided to put Rune's life in danger. At the same time, the young man was puzzled. He did not understand how long he should remain inactive. He did not know what he should do. But in turn, he met the heir of the Black Panthers. He saw before him an insatiable boy who got everything when he wanted something. He sincerely envied him, but at the same time, he said that he slept hugging a nasty toy, although he was already an adult. He was surprised that everyone called him the next head of the Black Panther lands. Ah-hin looked at the boy with fury and asked how dare he, who knew nothing about rabbit charm, say such a thing. At that very moment, he pulled the toy towards him and declared that he should look at it carefully. Rune was taken aback and shouted to his comrade to immediately remove the ugly rabbit from him. Ah-hin looked at his friend with anger, since his rabbit was not at all ugly. He hit his new acquaintance several times and declared that he should immediately repeat his words. Rune couldn't bear it and burst into tears at that very moment. Erwin ran to his master and asked him to calm down. He shouted to the young master that he had to attack quietly and secretly, otherwise he would get it from the adults. Achin looked at his comrade with anger and asked why he had called the lion's name before his own. He was angry because he did not know whose side his comrade was on. Irwin was taken aback, and a moment later declared that he was on the winning side. Ahin was shocked by such a statement, and at that very moment, he threw his toy at his friend and declared that he was a petty traitor. Irwin looked at the young gentleman with tears in his eyes and said that this was too much of him. Rillian burst into their room and asked what was going on, as he heard a child crying. Akin, in turn, only snorted, looking displeasedly at everyone present. A moment later, he sighed heavily as memories of his childhood encounter with Leo came flooding back. He knew that Leo had said back then that he couldn't stand rabbits, but now it was the other way around. But he didn't want to let him get what he wanted. Sometime later, the young man received a letter from his dearest friend, who wrote that if he showed his face again at his birthday party, he would kill him. Rune was puzzled by the contents of the letter, but he did not understand why his friend wrote such a letter to him at all. Leston sighed and stated that since the young gentleman had written something like that, they might not have gone to the celebration. After all, they didn't have to go to such an event at all. And he also stated that they could have sent other relatives. Rune sighed and told his assistant that it was impolite of him to look into someone else's correspondence. The young man was taken aback and shouted to his master that he was speaking seriously now. He said that he had already thought about something like this, because the Black Panther territory where Mr. Irwin lived was extremely bad soil. And what's more, there had been a lot of gossip about them lately. He was worried that his master might be in the spotlight because of the upcoming event. Rune, of a different opinion, said that he could meet with a forest nymph, but his subordinate said that he was still a lion, and a lion could not be afraid of a rabbit. A moment later, the young people, puzzled, screamed in limbo. Leston, looking at the young lady, greeted the heiress of the family. She looked closely at the young people but did not answer. A moment later, she stated that they could have avoided the hassle and simply gone to the reception, since such visits were the direct responsibility of allies. She looked menacingly at the young men and declared that she had decided to become an ally precisely because of them. Rune was taken aback and asked his sister to let them go. She said that in this way, they would be able to win in a direct confrontation, and he would no longer have to figure out who to chase. Leston, in turn, was taken aback and declared that he had to go about his business. Rune looked away from her and stated that he didn't know what to do. She looked closely at her brother and wondered if it was all about the nymph from the rumors. At that moment, he was taken aback, and she saw the expression on his face. After a moment, she finally let go of the young people, and they breathed a sigh of relief. She looked at her brother intently and declared that he should simply go and steal the nymph that he treasured so much. She said that once he had her, his sister would take care of dealing with the madman from the Black Panther clan. Rune was taken aback for a moment and froze in place. A moment later, he sighed heavily and asked if she hadn't noticed that he had returned home completely alone. He stated that the nymph had already driven him away, while his assistant froze in shock, as he had expected something completely different. Leston was shocked and did not understand when she managed to drive him away. He did not understand why she drove him away, and therefore he wondered if his master had been driven away right from the Rabbitlands. Rune sighed heavily and asked his subordinate how many times he needed to be told that she had simply driven him away and that all other questions were simply pointless. The young man was puzzled and shouted at his master that he should have asked him for advice, because knowing him, he could have told her something very strange. The young lady sighed heavily and asked what good was his face, which he was proud of, since he had suffered defeat. She shouted angrily that since it was useless, then he should take his original form and perform his mating dance. At that very moment, she threw the young people out. They were puzzled because they did not expect such a thing from her. Leston sighed heavily and declared that he would definitely have a bruise after the beating, but a moment later, he asked the gentleman how he felt. Rune, in turn, wondered if he should return to his lion nature and actually perform the mating dance. He laughed as he realized that the rabbit would be able to do the pirouette. After some time, the young man slowly got ready. Vivi looked at him in surprise and wondered why he was getting ready on his own, and at the same time, she asked what he was talking about. He said with a smile that he was talking about his first pheromone attack, which happened at the age of 15, and it happened right after the coming-of-age ceremony. Vivi was shocked by what she heard. She asked how many years he had been putting up with this, but he said with a smile that she would find out the rest herself. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and said that he was too busy and didn't have time to dance now, but she would still go ask his grandfather or mother for such information. At that very moment, she stood in front of him and stopped him because she wanted to have a normal conversation. At that very moment, the young man knocked on his master's door and announced that he had a very busy schedule today, and therefore, it was time for him to go. But the young lady only looked at him menacingly, as she had no intention of letting him go anywhere. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked why she was following him. She sighed heavily and said that he should just figure it out for himself. Vivi said they had been going out to do errands together lately. She screamed that he could just put her in his pocket. The young man froze in place in surprise, as he did not understand how he was supposed to do something like that. He asked in surprise if he should really put it in his pocket. And at that very moment, she realized that she had said something absurd. He looked at her with a smile and said that he couldn't do this now. Vivi sheepishly stated that she knew about it herself. He smiled and said that she was now too big for his pockets. She walked away from him embarrassedly and shouted that she was well aware of this, and she also stated that she was just joking. For some time, the young man stared after her, and after a few minutes of reflection, he declared that he knew what he should do. Vivi turned around and looked at him with a smile as she waited for the issue to be resolved. Leaving the room, he called his assistant. The young man bowed at that very moment, awaiting an order. A moment later, Ahin shouted to his assistant to immediately bring some kind of bag. The young man was taken aback, as he did not understand what his master was talking about. Ahin looked at his assistant with all seriousness and declared that he should bring some kind of bag, be it a bag, so that the young lady could fit into it. Vivi stood there dumbfounded for a moment, but a moment later she asked, confused, what he was even talking about. Achin's father, Edis, died very young, although he survived a pheromone attack at the age of 18. But the young gentleman's first attack occurred at the age of 15, which was too early for him, and the young lady wondered how much he had suffered from loneliness and fear in the face of death. She really hoped that she would be able to help him soon. She understood that she would do anything, even if it meant sacrificing her human form. She understood that she would take the form of a rabbit, in which it would be easier for her to control her pheromones. She wanted to throw all her efforts into healing him. After some time, the gentleman told the young lady with surprise that her desire to study was simply excellent, and he did not spare praise for her. He sighed and stated that the healing pheromone is divided into soporific, anesthetic, and healing. Moments later, he stated that she should first use anesthesia on the hawk, which was now next to her. At that moment, the hawk was taken aback and looked at the little rabbit with a puzzled expression. A moment later, the man said that she should use her pheromones on Erwin, who was in the hallway, because he was a moving target, and she needed to be especially careful not to miss. She only received praise from the master, and after a moment, he declared that this time, she should try to shoot the pheromone at them, in as short a time as possible. A moment later, the young lady met Ril. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was dressed like that because of the young master's upcoming birthday. He said with a smile that she was very sweet and that the hat suited her very well. But the young lady was puzzled, as she wanted him to answer her questions first, as she had a lot to do. He briefly wondered if the young gentleman had been acting strangely, sighing heavily. He claimed he hadn't even known anything like that. He said that the young master always greeted his subordinate with joy, and at the same time he was happy when she dirtied the paper with her front paws and put her imprint on his documents. He wanted to create a special seal for the rabbit. A moment later, he told the young lady everything about the young master, and she looked at him, puzzled. She sighed, as she realized that she had received some kind of answer from him. She knew that the young gentleman always behaved very strangely. Ril looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if those were all the questions. She touched him with a smile as the first interrogation was over. After some time, she visited Yuan, and Vivi wondered if he knew about his master's forests, but he only said with a smile that in her cloak she looked completely different, just like a real detective, and this made him very happy. She was shocked by his answer, and at the same moment, Ash and Vivi growled menacingly, looking at the young man. He looked at them in surprise and asked if they really wanted to know about the day the young master took on his true form. She winked at him with a smile, which was spot on. He sighed heavily, as he understood that this was a very difficult question, because in fact, he did not know when exactly the young master had approached him, since the end of the working day was approaching, and his only duty was to accompany the master to the bedroom. She sighed heavily, as she understood that this was very suspicious, because he said that he turned around just to scare her. She understood that if he had done it on purpose, then he could have taken human form already in the bedroom. At that very moment, she was so taken aback that she understood. She wondered if he had had a seizure that day before he came into her bedroom. She looked at the young man, wanting him to tell her immediately more about what had happened that day. A moment later, Erwin entered their room as he brought documents to his master. But at that very moment, he was taken aback and growled. He shouted to his master that Mrs. Rabbit had attacked everyone with her sweetheart again. He shouted and called for his master to come immediately and see everything with his own eyes. At that moment, Lord Rillian peeked out from around the corner and asked who was attacking whom. At that very moment, the gentleman saw the young lady in the form of a rabbit. She was taken aback as she realized that she had to run away faster. At that very moment, she mounted Baru, and they raced on at full speed. Mr. Rillian was furiously shouting at the young lady to stop, as she had attacked the servant and was now going to turn the whole house upside down, while she knew that her interrogation was over. After some time, she visited Madame, and Madame said with a smile that she had been expecting her at about that time, because in her house it was she who could give her the most exhaustive and desired answer. The Madame told the young lady with a smile that she had probably come to ask her the questions that had been bothering her, but to which she had never found an answer. She asked the young lady with a smile to come closer to her. At that very moment, Madame's expression changed, and she declared that in order to get what she wanted, she had to pay the exact price. After a few minutes, Madame Tiazzolo sighed heavily as she finally got the young lady in order. She looked at the cute little bunny with a smile, as she noticed that the translation was quite difficult for her. Vivi was shocked as she was dressed up as a ballerina. She looked at Madame in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she had dressed her like that. But at the same moment, she realized that Madame wanted her to dance. The Madame sighed heavily and stated that her son had told her that the young lady had danced before Leo. Vivi, in turn, wondered why Madame had dressed her in such an outfit and why she had raised such a topic. She looked with horror at Madame, who looked at her with a joyful smile. Vivi was puzzled by everything that was happening, but at the same time, she understood that the inevitable was waiting for her. A moment later, she gracefully pointed her toes and moved as if she could feel the wind with her whole body. She was moved by pure and sincere girlish feelings in her heart, and at the same time, she fluttered like a bird in the sky. She wanted everyone to look at her, because it was her dance. Madame, in turn, rejoiced, looking at the little rabbit, since this dance was inimitable. She said, with tears in her eyes and a gentle smile, that the young lady was indeed talented, as the rumors said. She said that at their banquet, she would look perfect. Vivi was shocked and knew it was very shameful, but she wondered, what if she had lost consciousness and only woke up now? She just wanted to hide so no one would see her. The Madame looked at the young lady with a tender smile and thanked her for such a thing, as she had not had such fun for a long time. She stated that Vivi showed her a delightful dance, and now it was her turn to repay her. Valens looked closely at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to know about her husband and the pheromone attacks. Vivi nodded in response, as that was the main question that interested her. The lady smiled and stated that her son had just recently confessed to her that he had actually been suffering from seizures for quite a long time. She stated that there was no cure for it, and for this reason, he hid the truth from her. Vivi was surprised that the young man actually told his mother about something like this. For a moment, Madame looked at her and asked if she knew anything about the limits of the suppression pheromone's power. The Madame stated that this was a pheromone that even her son, who was the heir of the family, was unable to control because the limits were so unknown. She knew that with the help of this pheromone, it was possible to control someone else's mind. The young lady was shocked. She didn't expect to hear something like that. She stated that her husband tried not to resort to the power of the suppressive pheromone due to the difficulty of controlling this enormous power. At the same time, she stated that her son, on the contrary, could easily be controlled by pheromones from early childhood, and perhaps it was all thanks to genes. She knew that no matter how easy it was for him to use the pheromone, while there was a risk of an attack, he shouldn't do it. But taking the position of the future head of the family and not using it was extremely difficult. She knew the reason why her son had experienced his first attack at an even earlier age than his father. Madame sighed and stated that at some point, the anesthetic pheromones stopped working on him. She realized that this was most likely the reason why he constantly tried to hide from them when he had seizures. She screamed and asked her husband to stay in the bedroom, but he did not listen to her. She knew that her husband was a very stubborn man, but later, in the midst of another attack, He closed his eyes forever, and their son became the first person to find it. She smiled and stated that her son often played with his father, was fine, and that was why something like this happened. The madam looked at the young lady with a gentle smile, but a moment later, she was taken aback and asked why she was crying. Vivi raised that the lady was very strong, but she was not like that. Madame looked at her tenderly and wiped away her tears. She said with a smile that her son had since drawn his own conclusions, and what had happened to his father had shown his possible fate. She knew that he was a smart boy from an early age, so no matter how hard she tried, she could not hide the truth from him. Madame stated that after his coming-of-age ceremony at the age of 15, he suddenly told Tema about her remarriage. She was shocked by this because she knew that he was healthy and alive, but his words were equivalent to a request to get a new receiver. That same day, their first quarrel occurred, but as it turned out, the reason for this was his first attack. Madame understood that she was irresponsible then, since he was born with a much healthier body than his father. She was sure that the attack should also begin later than his father's. Vivi looked at Madame intently, as she didn't want her to cry. Madame sighed and stated with tears in her eyes that as the head of the lands, she was obliged to create a new successor to avoid risks, but she was unable to do so. She said that the very thought of it made her feel as if she were losing her son, just as she had already lost her husband. She loved them both more than she could have imagined. After some time of their sad conversation, the madam looked at the young lady with a tender smile as she saw that she had fallen asleep, and at the same time, she realized that in such circumstances, it would be better for her to wait for the arrival of her son. She stared at the rabbit for a moment, but moments later, she told her guards to relax, as she had no intention of harming their mistress. Valens sighed heavily and, looking at them, declared that it was still a wonderful quality. A moment later, the young gentleman burst into his mother's office and looked at her menacingly. He approached her hastily, as he knew that his companion was next to his mother. The madam looked closely at her son and told him to be quiet, as she had given her a hard time today. She wanted the baby to sleep peacefully. At that very moment, he quietly lifted the young lady. Achin glanced sideways at his mother and stated that he assumed she had told her everything. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and wondered how he could be with her. The lady froze for a moment as she saw that her son looked as if he was ready to give his all to the little rabbit. She sighed and stated that she felt very sorry for the baby, as she had suddenly appeared in his life. He sighed and stated that he was completely under her paw. Madame asked in surprise if that was really the case, and she also asked if he would lick her paw like a slave. He smiled and stated that it sounded great. A moment later, an awkward silence fell between them. At that very moment, the young man called his mother, but she interrupted him and said that if he was going to tell her that he wanted to lick the rabbit's paw, then he could leave immediately. Achin stated that he was planning to go to the Bearland immediately after his birthday. She was surprised that he wanted to go so far. Ahin said he got the information from Hawk, and apparently it was many years ago, but there was still someone there with a pheromone under pressure. After hearing this, Madame froze in a daze. She sighed and stated that she had not been able to find out anything like this in all 10 years of searching. She was surprised that his bird had told him this story. She sighed and stated that it seemed that the rumors about their kind providing special information were not a lie. Ahin stated that, in fact, it took Quinn years to find out such information, but it was not a fact that even his trip to the bear country would bring any benefit. She said with a smile that she could not have imagined such a thing, and she did not even realize the irony of fate when he brought the half-dead falcon into the house. At that very moment she sighed, because she realized that perhaps the real irony of fate was the little rabbit. She looked at her son with a smile and asked why he didn't let her admire the rabbits. He sighed and said that she had enough of admiring her. Ahin looked at Rabbit tenderly and declared that when he went to the land of the bears, he would have to leave her. At that very moment he smiled, enjoying every minute spent with her. Madame asked if he really wanted to leave her in that place, since the Bearlands were far away. She asked what he was going to do with the attacks without her. He sighed heavily and declared that he would not die from the attacks. She was surprised and wondered why he wanted to leave her in the estate at all. He thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer his mother. After a moment, he declared that he would tell when he was absolutely sure. The madam looked after her son in surprise. A moment later, she said with a smile that at first the lady was seen as a spare snack, or something like that. He treated her very lightly in his mind, but now she had become an integral part of his life. After some time, the young people joyfully greeted the gentleman. The young man looked closely at the gentleman and said that he looked especially happy. He wanted to know what made him so happy. At that very moment, the man, with a fierce grin, declared that something had indeed made him happy. A moment later, he burst into wild laughter. He said with a smile that he simply could not stop laughing because he had such a wonderful student that he had been very pleased with her lately. He knew she was no ordinary student. At the same time, he understood that it was not for nothing that the Great Rabbit had managed to drive the entire Grace family under his paws. He understood that for the first time in his students, he had such a hard-working and passionate talent, which he was proud of, and at the same time, he was proud of himself. Ahin asked the young lady in surprise how much longer she would practice. He wanted to know how much longer she would study because he wanted her to play with him. At the same time, she bit him every time because she wanted him to calm down and not disturb her. The man knew that she knew no boundaries, and she even kicked away her grandson who was neglecting his grandfather. He was shocked and wondered where the wise warrior had come from, but the man felt freshness in every blow she struck. A moment later, all his mood evaporated as an old friend came up to him who said that he was making strange sounds, and at the same time, the man asked his old friend if he had really started to suffer from senile dementia. Mr. Rillian turned around and sighed heavily as he realized that his comrade had approached him, for no one else could greet him so vulgarly. He knew that the lions were supposed to arrive that day. The man smiled and told his friend that he was still as straightforward as ever. Mr. Rillian sighed heavily and asked his comrade in confusion why he had come. He wanted to know where his grandson, who was supposed to visit them, was. The man smiled and said that he had come with his grandson, but he immediately rushed off to look for someone. At the same time, the man wondered who his grandson could be looking for in the lands of the Black Panthers. Meanwhile, the young lady, without wasting a single minute, practiced her strength. Now she will be forged not by one opponent, but by several at once. They looked at her menacingly and immediately began to growl, but she called them to her with a smile as she wanted them to attack her. At that very moment, the panther rushed towards her menacingly, but Vivi stared at her opponents, and she didn't even move from her spot. At that very moment, they growled menacingly, rushing at her, but a moment later, she was taken aback as her opponent began to purr softly in front of her. And at that very moment, Ash licked her tenderly. The maid looked at him sharply and said that he should stop doing something like that. Vivi was shocked because she knew he shouldn't behave like that. She was puzzled as she knew he should take their training more seriously. She understood that if he continued in this direction, she would die from his cuteness. In turn, Ahin watched them closely, and he saw that their fight looked very funny and cute. Erwin looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked why he was waving the carrot, since he knew that Mrs. Rabbit would not be able to eat it. He smiled and stated that this was the reason he was waving it. Erwin sighed and stated that this was apparently a sign of protest, because Miss Rabbit was not having fun with him. The young master quickly threatened his subordinate to shut his mouth. But a moment later, he looked away and noticed familiar silhouettes in the distance. He clearly saw his grandfather and realized that the day of the Lion Clan's visit had already arrived. At the same time, he wondered if they had changed their minds. Achin also understood that if they did not value their lives, they could pay them a visit. The man, taken aback, looked at his friend and told him to look at the article in the newspaper. To his regret, his old friend did not answer, and he continued to insist that he had to look at the newspaper. Mr. Rillian So did not understand why he was following him and even yelling at him. The man stated that he wanted to clarify something with him regarding the rumors in the article. Mr. Rillian sighed heavily as he understood that everything was already clear, because the story of his grandson and the nymph was captured there. Mr. Rillian sighed heavily and asked his friend if he really believed everything that was written in the newspapers. Ezrin sighed and stated that rumors about their grandchildren had already spread everywhere, and everyone said that they had failed as men. Mr. Rillian was taken aback and angrily asked who had said such a thing. He shouted that his grandson was fine below the head. Ezrin sighed and stated that his grandson was also fine, except for the dull look in his eyes. Meanwhile, the servants looked at their masters with bewilderment, and at the same time, they simply wanted to pretend that they had not heard such a thing from them. Ezrin looked at his old friend with a smile and stated that, judging by his reaction, he had worried for nothing. Ezrin said with a smile that his grandson would hardly compete with a dancer who didn't even know the simplest steps. Ezrin asked with a smirk, "What about nymph?" He was surprised that everyone still used such a village word. At the same time, he stated that he was outraged when he saw what kind of gossip the servants were reading. He felt sorry for his friend's grandson, because there was a rumor about him that he ate at the same table with a rabbit. He said that people were spreading ridiculous rumors, and at the same time, he was no longer laughing because of such things. Ezrin thought for a moment and said that there is nothing to take from street dancers, and it is impossible to just look at them. At the same moment, his friend looked at him with fury, menacingly asked what he was talking about. The man looked at his friend in bewilderment, as he did not understand his violent reaction. Mr. Rillian, in turn, was seething with rage and anger. After a moment, he looked away from his old friend and declared that if you saw the dancer in person, there would be something to see. A moment later, he stomped off in a completely different direction. The man looked at his comrade in bewilderment, as he did not understand what he was saying at all. Meanwhile, the young man walked around the estate in search of the young lady. He was puzzled and wondered what he should say if he met her. He sighed and wondered if he should dance a mating dance in front of her. But after a moment, he pushed the extraneous thoughts away, as he knew that he needed to calm down. After some time, he finally saw the young lady. At that very moment, he primped himself and hurried to meet her. Everyone present was momentarily taken aback when they saw him. Mamie looked at the young gentleman in surprise and immediately greeted him, but he stopped her. He hurried towards the young lady with a joyful smile, and after a moment, he extended his hand to her and called out. For some time, she looked at him intently in surprise. He smiled and asked how she had wished all this time. She stared at him for a moment, not looking away. But a moment later, Ayan came up to them and told Rune that if he died, she would feel better than ever. Rune looked menacingly at his comrade and stated that he had actually asked the young lady, not him. Achen looked at him intently, but did not answer. A moment later, he could not bear it any longer and said angrily that his comrade had come to them himself, knowing that certain death awaited him here. At that very moment, Erwin shouted to his master and asked why he had jumped out of the window in front of everyone. Ahin sighed heavily and told the little rabbit not to pay attention to the lion. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he suddenly ran out of the house. But in turn, she saw that he was burning with anger and fury, looking at the lion. At that moment, she turned her gaze to the lion and wondered what he was doing on their lands. A moment later, she realized that he had arrived as a representative of the lion clan to the banquet in honor of the young master's birthday. But she was still a little puzzled, as she saw that there was a very tense atmosphere between them. She was in shock and did not understand what kind of atmosphere there was between them. It seemed to her as if she was standing on thin ice. At that moment, she was taken aback and wondered if it was all because of her. She understood that it was very hard for her because they thought she was wonderful. She wondered if they couldn't stand each other because they had feelings for her. Vivi looked at them with a smile because she understood that they were both very beautiful, but they were not indifferent to her, and at the same time, she was just a little rabbit. At that very moment, the young gentleman looked at her menacingly, and she shuddered. He moved closer to her and said that she was looking at them in a very sly way. She was taken aback because she did not know what he was talking about. Rune averted his confused gaze from her, as he did not expect his comrade to tell me that such things. Ahin was burning with anger and fury as he looked at them, while Vivi and Rune were filled with confusion as they looked at each other. Achen, in turn, quickly threw the carrot to the maid. At that very moment, he looked menacingly at his comrade and asked if he had really forgotten where he was. The young man sighed heavily as he realized that something very ominous was brewing. The young lady froze in shock when she saw such a sight. At the same time, she was surprised and puzzled because she did not understand why they behaved in this way. Rune, in turn, beat from behind that he had received an invitation and therefore was on the lands of the Black Panthers. He asked if there were any problems with this. Rune began to speak of the young lady, but his companion interrupted him and declared that he should not even speak her name. Vivi froze in shock. She wanted them to calm down and not do anything they might regret later. Rune looked closely at the young man and suggested that he stop there because they might not have respect for each other, but there had to be some limit. She was in shock and knew that if they continued to communicate like this, she would simply run away. Achen looked at him intently and stated that since he had something to say to him, he might as well take his eyes off the rabbit and say it directly. Vivi was shocked because she realized that in front of her was just a real beast. At that very moment, she jumped back from the ground and bent down towards them, as she wanted them to turn their attention to her. At that very moment, she fell before them, and a moment later, she stood up and looked at them menacingly. She only bothered to cast an angry glance at them, and a moment later, she simply ran away from them. The young people were shocked. They did not understand where she ran off to. A moment later, she stopped and turned around and looked at them menacingly. At the same moment, she stamped her little paw angrily on the ground. A moment later, she ran away from them, and she didn't want them to follow her. The young people were puzzled and did not understand why she behaved this way. Ezrin immediately screamed and broke the wall with rage because he was very angry with everything that was happening, and he did not understand at all what had happened. The gentleman looked closely at his comrade and declared that he could see a simple rabbit. Ezrin screamed in rage that he realized it was a rabbit in front of him, but he was furious because the young people were afraid of the rabbit, which was the size of his palm, so they fell at her paws. Mr. Rillian sighed heavily, looking at his comrade, for he recognized himself in him. Ezrin immediately grabbed his friend by the hands and declared that this would not do, and he must meet the rabbit right now. Mr. Rillian looked at his old friend in surprise and asked what he said. Mr. Rillian looked at the man intently and asked him to keep his promises. He told the man that he had given his word not to ask anything. Ezrin sighed heavily and stated that he remembered his promise very well, because they had already discussed this topic many times. The man shouted to his friend that he had months instead of brains, so he was afraid that he could forget about his promise. Therefore, he was friendly, reminded him of this. Ezrin was shocked and did not expect to hear such a thing. At that moment, the young lady looked at them in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was going on at all. Ezrin, in turn, looked menacingly at the small and defenseless rabbit. Vivi was immediately taken aback, as she did not expect such a fierce look. Ezrin said that he would like to talk about his grandson, because even though he was lazy, if he did something, he did it conscientiously. And even though he had a dull look, at the right moment, his eyes lit up. He said he just didn't know what she was doing when the fire lit up her brave eyes. He said his grandson was impressive. She looked at him in surprise, as she had already imagined something like this. Mr. Rillian sighed and said that there was no need to react so furiously to everything. He said that after his friend's boasting, he should go on and on about how good his muscles and strength were, and the man looked menacingly at his friend, because he was boring. At that very moment, they began a verbal altercation. A moment later, the man sighed heavily and declared that he had nothing more to tell her. She pulled the dessert out for him because she knew he could continue bragging, but he didn't seem like a bad person to her. The man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing from the tiny creature. But after a moment, he tensed up and glanced sideways out the window as he heard a noise. After a moment, they looked intently at the window, but they were wary. Ezrin Grosno announced to everyone present that they had an uninvited guest outside their window. The gentleman stated that no one could get past their security. Ezrin said with a grin that in the chaos of preparing for the banquet, no one knew what kind of weasel in its true form could have slipped through to them. He said with a smile that it must be a completely fearless beast since it decided to hide under his nose. Mr. Rillian was surprised as the uninvited guest got close to them, because he did not even imagine how dangerous it could be for him. At that very moment, everyone present was taken aback as a loud crash rang out because the glass had broken. Ezrin looked into the distance with a grin and ordered the unexpected guest to show himself. At that very moment, the gentleman covered the young lady with his hand so that she would not be hurt by the fragments. Mr. Rillian looked at his friend with fury, as he did not understand how he could easily break other people's windows. The man said with a smile that it was just a warning blow, and in the end, he would pay for the window. Mr. Rillian shouted angrily at his friend that he had asked him to behave normally in his house. Rune looked at his grandfather intently and said that he should behave appropriately. The man sighed heavily and looked menacingly at his grandson. Rune was shocked and shouted to his grandfather that a little more and he would be all in pieces. Ezrin sighed heavily as he looked at his grandson, but he also wondered why he had climbed through the window, since there was a door in the room. The young man stated that he was going to leave through the door, but there were Black Panther guards there, and they said that everyone who entered the room was eaten. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly, numbly, in the arms of the gentleman. Moments later, she was taken aback, looking at the man, and she felt a flush of heat. After some time, the young gentleman stared at the pherenium, which was already ready for use. He knew that the young lady could use it several times. A moment later, he sighed heavily, as he realized that his refueling had taken a long time. He assumed that this would most likely be her last time using it, since by the time he used it, she would already have full control of her powers. Erwin sighed and stated that everything was correct. He knew that the gentleman had been immersed in pheromone control training day and night, and his attitude could not help but admire him. At that very moment, Erwin looked at his master in surprise, since he did not see any reaction from him. Had been so mean to Mrs. Rabbit lately. He said, with all due respect to him, that he wanted to know why he hadn't returned to her the jewels he had stolen from her box. The young gentleman was taken aback for a moment, not knowing what to answer. But after a moment, he stated that she had been inattentive to him lately. He knew that they would not be able to see each other while he was in the Bearlands. Erwin smiled and asked, regarding the trip, how about taking it with him this time? He stated that the young master could just carry it in his pocket. Ah-hin looked menacingly at his subordinate and declared that he should shut up. Erwin smiled and asked if he had to keep his mouth shut. Ah-hin said with a grin that it seemed like his subordinate was one of the timid ones. They were having a nice conversation and didn't notice anyone around them. But at that very moment, Sokol flew into their office. Ah-hin looked in surprise at the falcon, who was agitated by something. Quinn tried to explain something to the young master, but only about the task, but looked at him as he was flapping his wings all the time and nothing was clear. The young gentleman sighed heavily as he realized that it seemed he no longer considered himself doomed and had decided to begin a new life as a real bird. The young master realized that his subordinate was talking about his grandfather. He asked if the young lady had started drinking with his grandfather. Quinn quickly nodded his head in agreement. Ah-hin sighed heavily and asked his subordinate to continue the story, since he had not noticed anything special in this one. But at that very moment, he was taken aback and called his subordinates. Moments later, they hurried to meet the young lady. He was puzzled and did not know if his grandfather knew that the young lady, under the influence of foreign pheromones, could turn into a human. He understood that there would be no problems with his grandfather, but he would not have any problems with Lev. At the same time, the young lady looked at the lion in bewilderment as his pheromones penetrated her. Vivi was in shock, because she understood that at this rate, her pain would return, and she would turn into a human right in front of them. She understood that she needed to leave before something like this happened. Mr. Rillian asked in surprise whether she was scared or if something else had happened. At that moment, the man was taken aback and asked her for forgiveness. She was puzzled, because she understood that they had nothing to do with it. At that very moment, she looked at her comrade, and he asked what was the matter. She came closer to him as she wanted to explain everything. He looked at her intently and, shuddering, asked if she was really so excited because of that one. At that very moment, she bent down towards him as if she wanted him to catch her. Everyone present was shocked by her action, as they did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, he caught her, but in turn fell to the ground with a crash. She smiled and praised him for his good reaction. Without wasting a single minute, she jumped away from the lion and ran to the exit. She knocked on the door because she wanted her maid to open it for her and let her out. Rune came closer to her and, taking her in his arms, asked what had happened. He also said that he would open the door for her right now. After a moment, he looked at her closely and realized what was happening, but he still wondered if she was transforming. She nodded in agreement, but the young man was taken aback as everything happened very abruptly. At that very moment, he hid her and carried her out into the corridor. But at the same time, he was puzzled, since he did not know where he could have hidden her. The man looked after his grandson in surprise, since he did not understand what was happening at all. At that very moment, she began to wave and signal to him, as she remembered Pherenium, since Achin had said that today he would give her a new one. She knew that she had to go after him. The young man was taken aback and, asking for forgiveness, stated that he had not yet mastered the language of rabbits. She was in shock and understood that there was no time for this. She wanted him to let her go immediately. Rune immediately asked if she really wanted to go to Ah-hin. She was taken aback for a moment, as she did not expect to see such an expression on his face. But after a few moments, the young man finally let her go and said with a smile that it was time for her to go. She froze for a moment and looked at the young man with a puzzled expression. But at that very moment, she threw all her thoughts aside and ran. Moments later, the young lady ran down the corridor at the speed of light, thus frightening the local servants. Yuan shouted after the young lady to be careful, otherwise she might fall. Vivi was in shock and did not understand how much time had passed, but she understood that trouble had befallen her, and she could not have fallen in the corridor. With tears in her eyes, she screamed and mentally asked where her savior was. A moment later, she stood frozen in a daze in the middle of the corridor and wondered where the young master was, because she understood that at this rate, she would have to turn. But a moment later, she came to her senses, as she heard the voice of a young gentleman who was running towards her at full speed. He sighed heavily and looked closely at the young lady in the form of a rabbit. At that very moment, she shouted that trouble had happened, and at that very moment she turned her back to him. She wanted to explain that she was with Lord Ezrin, when suddenly she began to address. She was out of breath and her heart was pounding wildly, while the young gentleman looked at her with puzzlement, as he saw that she simply turned to him with a beautiful face and wagged her tail. She understood that she would soon turn into a human, so she tried with all her might to explain to him everything that was happening. But at that very moment, she declared that she needed Pherenium. The young man looked at this spectacle with bewilderment. After all, she tried to explain everything to him, but it so happened that she danced in front of him. She looked at her savior with fury, because she did not understand why he stood and trembled, since she understood that they could not delay. She came closer to him and tapped his leg with her paw. She did not understand why he froze. At that very moment, the young man came closer to her and, asking for forgiveness, declared that everything was ready. Akin held out Pherenium to her, and with that, the young lady breathed a sigh of relief. A moment later, she began her transformation into a human. Without wasting a minute, the young gentleman grabbed her and wrapped her in a blanket. But at the same time, he easily made it so that they moved to the next room. Vivi hurried to get out of the blanket, and with a heavy sigh, she realized that something bad had almost happened to her. A moment later, she raised her head and noticed the young man's intense gaze. She cried out in embarrassment that she had not done it on purpose, but that she had suddenly sensed the master's pheromone. At that very moment, the young man sighed heavily and asked his companion not to be so cruel. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But he only sighed heavily and asked her about it again. At that very moment, she reached out to him and asked how he knew about her appeal. He sighed and stated that it was all because the lion grandfather was too good at showing off his muscles. She asked in surprise if that was the reason he had run to her so quickly. The young gentleman looked tenderly at his companion and declared that he would always run to her. She was taken aback, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. But at that very moment, he asked with a smile if she really thought it would be different. At that very moment, the young people looked at each other intently, and they were very embarrassed. A moment later, they reached out to each other as if they wanted to kiss. But a moment later, the young lady heard a knock on the door and mechanically pushed her companion away, hitting him in the face. Meanwhile, the maid apologized to the young masters for disturbing them, but she also informed them that she had brought clothes for the young lady. Vivi shouted to her servant with a joyful smile and thanked her for this. After some time, the young man stood quietly near the door, after everything that had happened. But at that very moment, he remembered the human form of the young lady. After all, she was very sweet and beautiful, and also charming. He sighed heavily and burst into tears with embarrassment. But at the same time, he realized that he would soon go crazy. He was puzzled, because he knew she was very beautiful and had eyes only for him. Yet, he couldn't take his eyes off her. At that very moment, he remembered her recent dance. At the same time, the young gentleman became furious as he realized that the lion had seen the dance first. Meanwhile, the Black Panthers looked at their master in bewilderment, as if they did not understand what was happening to him at all. But after a few minutes, Vivi came out to him with a joyful smile. She looked closely at the young man and asked how long he had been waiting for her. But at the same time, she apologized for the wait. He stood frozen in a daze and was at the same time very embarrassed, and his heart was pounding furiously. A moment later, he announced that he had not waited for her too long. The young people looked at each other intently for a while. Mamie, in turn, quickly took the Black Panthers away, as she wanted the young people to talk in private. Akin looked at his companion with a gentle smile and invited her to take a short walk. She looked at him in surprise and, looking away, asked if they would really go like that. She sighed heavily and stated that they could be noticed, and that it was very indecent. Ahin looked at his companion in surprise and asked why she thought so. He also asked if she had never been accompanied by anyone. She sighed heavily and stated that this was true. Akin looked away from her and timidly stated that he was actually in the same situation. She looked at him in surprise and asked with embarrassment if he really had no one with him. She wanted to know how he had attended dinners with his mother before. He sighed and stated that the heads of the Black Panthers always entered the reception halls alone. At that very moment, he extended his hand to her, but the young lady froze for a moment. A few seconds later, she came to her senses and, smiling shyly, took his hand. He smiled and said that if she didn't like it, then she could think that they were walking and he was holding her front paw. She was shocked and screamed that now he was holding her hand, not her paw. He smiled and said that for this reason, she could simply imagine a different picture. A few minutes later, the young lady turned around and was momentarily taken aback as she saw the servants looking at her with a smile. She looked at her companion in surprise, as they were actively whispering to each other and saying that it was the first time they had seen Mrs. Rabbit in human form. She burst into tears as she realized that the terrible predator really was a fool. She knew that he was the next head of the family, and while there was nothing good in behaving like this in front of the servants, she understood that it would be better if he did not go with her. A moment later, he announced that after his birthday, he would have to go to the Bear Land. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. But at that very moment, she said that she would also go with him. Unfortunately, she did not have time to finish speaking when suddenly they heard a scream. Mr. Rillian shouted furiously at Erwin and declared that the rabbit was missing, but that he was just walking around and chilling. Erwin was in shock and shouted at the gentleman to calm down. The man shouted that she must have been very scared when that ignorant man used his pheromone. He was very worried and puzzled because he understood that the small and timid rabbit could not stand such a thing. He shouted that for this reason, it was necessary to find her before his grandson went crazy. But at that very moment, the young lady disturbed them and called out to her grandfather with a smile. The man froze in place when he heard her beautiful voice. At that moment, he turned around and looked at them with bewilderment. For a moment, he stood there in a daze, looking the young lady up and down. But at that very moment, he turned his gaze to his grandson and back to the young lady, for he saw that they looked harmonious. A moment later, he came to his senses and realized that there was chemistry between them. At that very moment, he shouted to Erwin that they had to go and look for the rabbit right away. Erwin looked at the gentleman in surprise, not understanding what he was even talking about, since the rabbit was right in front of him. The man was furious and shouted at the young man not to spoil all the raspberries. He shouted at him that his sixth sense told him that the rabbit was now in the stable. The gentleman shouted that a gorilla worked in the stable and that a little rabbit was in close contact with him. Erwin looked at the old man in bewilderment and shouted that this was not so, but the old man did not want to listen to him. Vivi looked after them with bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened. Achin looked at his companion, because he knew that some lion had seen her dancing and even called her by name. But what annoyed him more was that she was still in close contact with the gorilla. The young lady was taken aback and shouted that this was not true at all. He looked at her menacingly and asked if she would like to go to one of the spare rooms and discuss this matter in more detail with him. After some time, the young master handed over the beautiful artifact to his companion. At the same time, he said that he was giving it to her. She was surprised since no one had ever given her something like this before. At that very moment, she said that his birthday would soon be passing. He said with a smile that it was so. She said that she had thought for a long time, but still had not come up with what kind of gift could please him. He looked at her with a smile and asked why she should worry about something like that. Vivi said that she wanted to give him something. She asked if there was something that he wanted with all his heart. He said with a smile that there was, of course, a lot of that. She asked with a smile what it could be. Ahin looked at her and declared that when they quarreled, she should not run away from him, neither into Irvin's pocket nor into the maid's room. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was even talking about. She asked if he really considered this a gift. He also said that cheating was prohibited. He said that only today already, a lion and even a gorilla were mentioned. She was shocked, but he said that after turning into a human, she should stay in his house. Vivi was puzzled, since he had many desires. At that very moment, he came closer to her and asked with a smile if he could ask her for something. She was embarrassed and said that he shouldn't ask for anything else, and that was the end of the wish list. Akin, in turn, only looked at her with a smile. Moments later, he stated that he didn't want anything special. He said that if he made any mistake first, then she should accept his apology. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she did not expect to hear anything like that from him. A moment later, she asked if he had already done something wrong to her. He smiled and stated that so far, he had done nothing wrong. Ahin said with a smile that he was saying this just in case, because sometimes she turned into an overly indifferent rabbit. The next day, the young lady was lying in bed. Ahin sighed heavily, looking at his companion, and declared that if she was already sleeping, then she should sleep normally. Erwin noticed that when she was angry and wrapped herself in a blanket, she looked very much like a cake. He said that he actually mistook it for a cake that would be served at a reception to celebrate the young gentleman's birthday. Ahin said with a smile that they would entrust the decorations to Quinn. Erwin smiled and said that then it would be enough to decorate it with a bunch of strawberries. She was furious. because she understood that they were predators and thought only about eating someone. At that very moment, she declared to Erwin that from the moment she saw him until today, she hated him. At that very moment, Erwin declared that hatred was also one of the variations of attention, and he gratefully accepted her attention to his humble person. The young master immediately drove away his subordinate. Erwin bowed and told the lady that if she felt hatred towards him, he did not feel the same towards her. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. At that very moment, his face changed, and he declared that since she had said that she hated him, he would call the chef. Vivi was shocked and screamed that he was an ill-mannered predator. Moments later, the young people were left alone in the room. She sighed and called the young master. At that very moment, she shouted that she could also go to the Bearland. But he quickly stated that she couldn't do that. Achin understood perfectly well that it was dangerous there, and if they did not go by water, then they would have to go through the desert. She was scared because she knew he would be gone for a whole month. At the same time, she was worried that he might have seizures. She screamed that she heard that the road through the desert was very dangerous. And now that she could control the pheromones, she could have gone with him. But the young man was adamant and said that she would stay at home. She understood that everything was very strange, since the pain during attacks is not something that can be simply endured. She knew that even his father died from an attack. At the same time, she wondered if this was the only reason why he did not want to take her. At that very moment, the young lady tripped and fell straight into the young man's arms. He looked at her in surprise, but still managed to catch it. She hugged him tightly and said that she also wanted to go with him. He sighed and said that first he would put her to bed, and then they would continue the conversation. She screamed that she didn't want to, and if he moved, she would run away. Ahin sighed and asked her to calm down and not be stupid. Vivi screamed that he should take her with him. She was furious and asked why she spent days and nights learning to control her pheromone. She knew that no one except her could help him with the attacks. At the same time, she did not understand why he left her again and again and went away alone. She was worried that he might have a seizure after leaving, and at the same time, she knew that she could not just sit idly by. She screamed that if he left her, she would go after him. Ahin said that it was very dangerous. Vivi sighed and said that if he did not like this idea, then he should explain to her why he did not want to take her with him. But the young man only looked at her intently, unable to explain his decision. After a moment, he sighed heavily and stated that the last time she had to use pheromones to calm his fit, she had gotten into a lot of trouble. Vivi asked in surprise if he really wanted to know if it had been hard for her. She knew she had been a little tired then. Ahin said that at that moment he felt not how she was transmitting her pheromones to him, but it seemed to him that he had sucked all the juices out of her. He says that he felt that the pheromones she gave him were not enough, and he wanted to sink his teeth into her neck. For this reason, he was based on the fact that he could harm her. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Ahin said that if this happens, where there is not even a doctor, he will lose his mind again, and something irreversible might happen to her. She was shocked because she knew he was worried about her. But at that very moment, she declared that she was not afraid of such an outcome. She said with a smile that he knew very well that she was a master at running away from dangers of all kinds. He sighed and declared that he was not joking and was speaking in all seriousness. Vivi said that if she was in danger, she would simply stun him and run away. She knew that she was an excellent runner, and besides, now the probability of him biting her was much lower than the probability of an attack. She knew he wanted to intimidate her into giving up the trip, but she had no intention of doing anything like that. Vivi stated that she would do this because he was trying to distance himself from her. He looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if she shouldn't say something like that she didn't care if he bit her because it was for his own good. She looked away from him and declared that she would run away from him until he came to his senses. He sighed and asked if she remembered that she had already asked him about this. He asked her if she remembered asking what the point of biting someone's neck was. He sighed and stated that this was how the predator marked its territory. Ahin said with a grin that he wanted to do it again, and at the same moment he asked if he could do something similar. When she was little, one maid read her fairy tales. She said that the predator is much larger and more graceful than the herbivores. At the same time, the young lady did not understand why this was so, But after some time, she realized that the predator was like that because he could enchant his prey with his beauty. At that very moment, she froze in place and felt her predator approaching her with fangs ready. She was taken aback as she realized that she was fascinated by the Black Panther. After some time, the maid looked at the young lady with puzzlement. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and declared that she would bring a scarf to cover the trail. Vivi was very embarrassed at this, and she simply could not utter a word. She was puzzled and felt unbearably ashamed. At the same time, the maid told her mistress that she was now in the form of a human, and therefore she should not have been lying on the floor like a rabbit. After some time, the young lady met with Madame. The lady smiled, looking at the girl, and said that she had a very beautiful scarf, and it really livened up her image. Vivi looked at Madame with a smile and stated that it was so. At that very moment, the man looked at the young lady with surprise and a frown, as he did not understand why she had suddenly wrapped the scarf around herself. The lady looked closely at the girl and asked what she wanted to talk about. Vivi smiled and apologized to Madame, and also stated that she would not be attending the dinner party to celebrate the young master's birthday. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. The man looked at her in surprise and asked why she made such a decision. He said that if they did something wrong, then she should just tell them about it. She smiled and stated that the department was not involved in this matter. She simply thought it was better not to stick her nose into the cage with the predators. She understood that it would be scary to go there alone, so she invited the professor. But the professor asked for forgiveness because she wanted to live a little longer, so she could not come, and at the same time hoped for understanding. Vivi in turn understood her perfectly and could not blame her for refusing. Vivi knew that even the professor had refused, so she could not participate in such an event alone. Madame sighed heavily as she felt pity, but at the same time, she said that she had already prepared several dresses for her. The young lady smiled and apologized and stated that she would definitely wear them next time. Madame said with a smile that she should try them all on later. That same evening, Vivi looked around the situation. She understood that everyone was now in the banquet hall, so she wanted to quickly deliver the gift to the young gentleman. Moreover, she was not alone, but with her support group. They quickly jumped from one place to another. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as she noticed something. She came closer and saw the forest, as well as the room next to her. At that very moment, she screamed and hid behind her maid because she knew that the fox had predators. She was frightened by the teacher and suggested to her maid to leave the fox. But her maid stated that they could not do something like that. She stated that it was possible that it was an invited guest, and it was her duty as a housemaid to escort the guest to his quarters if any trouble arose. Therefore, she intended to take care of her when she returned. Vivi looked at her maid with admiration, as she understood that she was simply cool. A moment later, Mamie quietly approached the fox. She leaned towards her carefully and asked for forgiveness, but no one answered her. The young lady was shocked, as she saw that the forest did not even move. She assumed the worst, but her maid stated that Alice was simply unconscious. At that very moment, they breathed a sigh of relief. Mamie declared that she would immediately carry her into the room. A moment later, the young lady picked up the dress, as she assumed it was their fox's clothing. Looking at the maid, she offered to take the clothing. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as she guessed who the fox could really be. Leston, meanwhile, walked around the estate in search of his master. Last night, his master declared that he liked the similar rabbit even more than he had expected. He was puzzled when his master stated that he had no other choice. Now the young man was puzzled because his master had made a similar statement and disappeared into thin air. He was very worried, and he had a feeling that his heart would soon stop. He wondered if his master was really going to steal the rabbit. At the same time, he mentally asked his master to calm down. A moment later, he came to his senses and was distracted by hearing a familiar voice. Turning around, he saw Erwin giving orders to everyone else. Leston looked after the young man in surprise. At that very moment, he followed him, because he did not know where he was going, because it seemed to him that Erwin looked suspicious. Moments later, he entered the room, following the young man. He looked at Erwin in surprise as he stared at the cake. He was puzzled and did not know what Erwin was going to do, but a moment later, he noticed that the young man took something out of his pocket. Leston was taken aback and wondered if Erwin had actually taken out the poison. But a moment later, he saw that the young man had merely left a beautiful figurine of a rabbit on the cake. Leston was taken aback and stood frozen in place for a moment in surprise. But after a few seconds, he couldn't take it anymore and asked the young man what he was doing. Erwin looked menacingly at his opponent and declared that they had not seen each other for a long time. Leston shouted and asked if the situation really was conducive to a calm greeting. He did not understand what Erwin was doing with such an important cake for the reception. Erwin looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. After all, he had simply left a rabbit figurine. Leston said that with his actions he was making a laughingstock of Grace's family. Erwin smiled and said that there was no need to worry about this, because the lady approved of his decision. But the young man only shouted at Erwin not to say such nonsense. Leston reached for the figurine and said that he should remove such a thing before anyone saw. Erwin shouted with fury that the ceremony demanded it. He also told his opponent that everyone knew that he was a coward. Erwin looked at the young man with fury and said that he would like to give him one piece of advice, since they occupied similar positions. Erwin said that the family was now at the mercy of the rabbit, so they were taking special care of him, not allowing any problems. The young man came because he did not expect to hear anything like this. At the same time, he did not understand why his opponent had become so frank. Erwin said that as of yesterday, Mamie the maid who was attached to Mistress Rabbit was suddenly promoted to head maid. And this was a direct order from Mistress. And besides, his master no longer denied that he had fallen under her spell. Just as Mr. Rillion fell before the mighty paws of the rabbit lady, Irving said that now is the dawn of the age of rabbit's feet. Leston sighed heavily and asked the young man why he spoke utter nonsense every time they met. Erwin sighed heavily and felt sorry for his opponent, as he did not understand what opportunities he was losing. He also wondered what Leston was doing in such a place, since he should have been in the ceremonial hall. Leston was taken aback and asked the young man if he had seen that incident, but his master. Erwin immediately pointed in the direction where his master was. Leston was taken aback for a moment and froze in place when he saw his master in the form of a lion. Erwin looked at the young gentleman with a smile and asked if everything was okay with him. Rune, in turn, only raised his paw and purred with a smile. Leston froze in shock, not understanding what had happened, but a moment later he was taken aback and wondered why his master had turned into a lion. Meanwhile, the young ladies were staring at the forest, as she was tired and her instinct for self-preservation kicked in, so she simply returned to her true form. They were told that some time would pass and she would regain her human form. After some time, she finally opened her eyes and thus frightened Vivi. Vivi jumped away from the fox with the speed of lightning. Vivi noted with a smile that the fox was fine. At the same moment, she declared that in that case, they would already go. The fox looked closely at the young lady and with her paw asked her to come closer. Vivi looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand why she was offering to sit closer. But at that very moment, the fox began to take on its human form. The young lady was taken aback and hastened to present her with a blanket. She was shocked as the wheels suddenly became human. The lady said with a smile that there was no need to cover her. She thanked them with a smile for their help, but she said that it seemed like the abundance of males here had a negative impact on her condition. And sometimes it happened that she would return to her true form like this. Vivi, in turn, was very confused, because she had never heard anything like this before. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, as the lady grabbed her by the hair and tenderly declared that she was a beauty. She asked Vivi with a smile if she was the same rabbit she saw last time at the Lord's. She remarked that it was surprising, because she could not imagine that a grown girl could be a little rabbit. She said with a smile that she liked her scared face. She asked if she could see how Vivi was bursting into tears. Vivi was taken aback because she realized that the predator had completely gone crazy. The lady said with a smile that it was the first time she had seen a representative of the herbivores so close. Vivi was very puzzled, as she understood that the predator was approaching her very close. At the same time, she knew that it was dangerous now. She needed to come to her senses. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had a wound on her neck. She stated that although the girl had red markings, she still did not look like an adult rabbit, but like a little bunny. Vivi was taken aback and wondered if she really had any red marks. She remembered her family looking at her menacingly and asking why she hadn't turned into a human. They mocked her because she could not take human form. At the same time, they said that she was no different from an animal. After some time, the young lady stood near the mirror and looked at her marks. The maid called her mistress excitedly and wanted to know if she was okay. Vivi stated that she was fine and would be out soon. She remembered how the fox had told her about the red marks, and after some time, she became convinced of her words. Vivi knew the marks weren't particularly visible, but they were there. She wondered if this was a sign that the day was approaching when she would finally turn into a human, and she thought that she would be immensely happy when that day came. But now she wondered why she was so confused. Moments later, she looked at her maid with a smile and announced that it was time for them to leave. The lady looked at them in surprise and asked if they had really abandoned her in such a state. Vivi looked at her in bewilderment, and at that very moment, the lady asked what if she fainted again. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why predators were so cunning. She was confused because she understood that it was very difficult to deal with such pheromones. At that very moment, she fell under the charm of the cunning fox. Still, the young lady bowed low and wished her a speedy recovery. She looked at Vivi with a smile and said that she did not want to let her go so quickly. After all, she was much more interesting than the entire family of Black Panthers, and she smelled very appetizing. Vivi was frightened by her words, and at that very moment, she hid behind the back of her maid. She was puzzled and did not know what the cunning fox was saying. At the same time, she wondered if 5 men were not enough for her, and she was now targeting her. Vivi knew very well that the young lady was showing interest in Ah-hin. At that very moment, she couldn't stand it and shouted that he was hers. The young lady looked at her with a smile and said that it was a very interesting and sweet reaction. She asked with a smile if the girl had just spoken about the young man, Mr. Achin, and she said with a smile that it was very kind of her. Vivi was shocked and screamed that this was not true at all. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as she heard some kind of rumble behind the door, and at the same time, she heard a loud growl. At that very moment, the maid came to the door, as she heard her comrade growling menacingly. She wanted to check everything. At that very moment, she opened the door and froze for a moment, as she saw the terrible lion rushing into their room. Vivi froze in shock, but the fox simply looked at the lion in bewilderment. He looked at them menacingly. Vivi, in turn, was shocked by his enormous size, and in turn, she could not move. She was very scared, so she ran to the door with lightning speed. Yuan, standing in one of the rooms, looked in surprise at the young lady who was rushing down the corridor. A moment later, he looked in surprise at Ash and Mamie, who were chasing the young lady. But at that very moment, he was taken aback, because he saw a formidable lion who was rushing after them. A moment later, he looked after them with a smile and was happy for the rabbit lady because she was faster than everyone else. Meanwhile, the young lady ran away with tears in her eyes and begged someone to save her. At the same time, the young man was celebrating his birthday, standing in the banquet hall, and at the same time he was closely examining the beautiful figurine on his birthday cake. He understood that his companion was becoming more and more confident every day. At the same time, he understood that day and night, the distance between them continued to decrease, and he did not know what to do about it. Erwin looked at his master in surprise and asked if he didn't like the cake, as he saw that his master was puzzled by something. Ah-hin, in turn, stated that the young lady was not like herself because she was not so meek, and her look should have been more daring. At that very moment, Madame declared that the figure looked small, and it was not really visible. At that very moment, the gentleman confirmed Madame's words. Erwin was puzzled because no one liked the figurine. Ezrin looked at them with bewilderment and wondered if some disease had struck their family. He understood that they were all out of their minds. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and asked where his grandson had gone, since he had not seen him for a long time. The young man consoled him and began to make excuses. He stated that it seemed that the young gentleman had simply moved to a quiet place in order to rest. Meanwhile, Madame stared at the figurine, as it did not fully convey the cuteness of the rabbit, and the gentleman thought so too. Erwin was puzzled and did not know how to resolve this situation. He realized that he needed to quickly come up with an excuse. A moment later, the young man approached Erwin and told him something important. He quietly stated that where that hour ago, Mrs. Rabbit accidentally discovered the fox in an unconscious state, after which she was transferred to the infirmary. However, it seems that in the process of all this, Mrs. Eiley liked Mrs. Rabbit. Erwin realized that this was his chance to distract everyone from the figurine, which no one liked. Without wasting a minute, he shouted to his master that something bad had happened, because they said that Mrs. Rabbit had become infatuated with the fox. At that moment, the man was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Erwin stated that the young lady was now on the run. The young gentleman sighed heavily and asked with a smile if she had really run away with the fox. Erwin immediately said that this was not so, and she ran away with Lev. At that very moment, the young gentleman's face changed, and he angrily asked Erwin who she had run away with. The young maid looked closely at the lion and declared that she would bring him clothes so that he could return to human form. At that very moment, he nodded in agreement. Rune, in turn, suggested that the young lady had a hard time since the day she acquired human form. But at the same time, he was puzzled, because she was still afraid of predators. He had no intention of making fun of her for days, of mocking her, as the Black Panthers did. Moments later, he was walking along the opium road when he saw a young lady who was not like her former self. At that very moment, she, having gathered her courage, declared that she was not afraid of him, in the form of a lion. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. After a moment, she finally asked why he was following her. He looked at the young lady with a smile, as he did it just like that. At that moment, he sighed heavily and wondered why he couldn't meet her face to face without any obstacles. He understood that even when she first took on human form, even when she first put on a dress, even when she danced her enchanting dance with him, he was next to her. But at the same time, the young man was puzzled. He did not understand why, even in this case, he did not have a single chance. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he was in any pain, so he transformed. He understood that if he said that something hurt, he would get a little more attention from her. But at the same moment, he sighed heavily because he understood that he did not know how to lie, and she would immediately see through him. He was born the second child, and his elder sister was the head of the family, and he did not have the right to want anything or get what he wanted most. At that moment, she knocked on the window and asked if he was in pain or not. A moment later, he saw that the Black Panther had brought him things. The young lady realized that her maid had taken on the form of an animal in order to quickly return. At that moment, he was taken aback, as he felt the Black Panther's intense gaze on him. Leo was puzzled and did not understand why they were looking at him so intently. He knew it would be better if he attracted the attention of the young lady rather than the Black Panthers. At that very moment, she asked if there was something wrong with his paw. He remembered his sister saying that he had to gain her approval and favor, but he also had to dance his mating dance for her. He sighed heavily as he realized that he simply had no choice, and since she and everyone else, I looked at him so intently, he wanted to demonstrate why he came. Without wasting a minute, he got down to the most important part, namely, demonstrating his mating dance. At that very moment, everyone was taken aback, as he dazzled them with his mating dance. The knights looked at the werewolf in surprise, as they understood that he was simply stupid and doing stupid things. The man looked at his old friend in surprise, because he was so angry that he even broke his cane. But at the same moment, he asked what had happened as he had heard about the escape of the lion and the rabbit. He smiled and said that such a thing simply couldn't be true, and that she hadn't run away with his grandson. He assured his friend that his imagination had simply run wild. Mr. Rillian, in turn, angrily asked if rabbits could really be polygamous. The men were taken aback and stated that, as far as he knew, they had been both polygamous and monogamous. The man looked after his friend with puzzlement, as he seemed somehow strange. Mr. Rillian, in turn, was furious and shocked. He shouted that the young lady was just a flighty girl,